She was just a teenager, quietly sitting in her seat, excited for her flight, but within minutes a flight attendant stood over her, demanding she move. Loudly, in front of everyone. She was humiliated, treated like she didn't belong. In that crushing moment, every sneer and dismissive glance magnified her isolation, as if the entire cabin were echoing a verdict of unworthiness. Yet behind that harsh rebuke lay a secret no one could foresee. Her father was the powerful owner of the entire airline. In a breathtaking twist that defied every expectation, the tide swiftly turned, leaving the crew and passengers utterly stunned by the unfolding reckoning. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. She was just a young girl sitting quietly in her seat, her small backpack tucked neatly under the chair in front of her. Boarding the plane alone, Zara Collins clutched her ticket as though it were a precious talisman, her heart pulsating with equal parts excitement and nervous anticipation. This was her inaugural flight without the reassuring presence of her family, a daring step into the unknown that filled her with both pride and a touch of trepidation. Dressed in a modest hoodie and jeans, she exuded a quiet confidence. Her curly hair, carefully gathered into a neat ponytail, framed a determined gaze that spoke of resilience and dreams yet to be fulfilled. As she sank into the plush comfort of her first-class seat, a stark upgrade from the cramped economy rides of her childhood, she allowed herself a moment of introspection, savoring the soft hum of the cabin and the bustling choreography unfolding outside the window. Every detail, from the subtle rustle of pages in the book she had chosen to accompany her, to the gentle rhythm of her favorite music, echoed her deep sense of achievement. A hard-won reward for excelling in school, gifted by her father. Yet, just as the tender glow of accomplishment began to warm her spirit, the moment was abrupt. A flight attendant named Miss Elise walked down the aisle, checking passengers and their seatbelts. She was tall, with sharp features and an even sharper gaze. Her uniform was crisp, and she carried herself with authority, as if she believed she owned the plane. When her eyes landed on Zara Collins, she stopped abruptly, her friendly expression fading into a slight frown. She took a step closer, her tone firm and impatient. "Excuse me, miss. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Miss Elise's voice was loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, causing a few heads to turn. Zara Collins looked up, surprised. She pulled out her boarding pass from the pocket of her hoodie and handed it to Miss Elise with a polite smile. "Yes, I'm in SE2A." Miss Elise scanned the ticket, her eyes narrowing. She paused, then looked back at Zara Collins with a skeptical expression. "This is a first-class ticket," she said slowly, as if Zara Collins didn't understand. "Are you traveling with someone?" "No, I'm traveling alone," Zara Collins replied, her voice steady but quiet, not expecting to be questioned like this. Miss Elise's lips tightened. She handed the ticket back but didn't move on. Instead, she placed her hands on her hips and leaned slightly forward. "I think there's been a mistake. You can't sit here. This seat is reserved for first-class passengers." Zara Collins' heart skipped a beat. She blinked, confused, but thought, "This is my seat. I have a first-class ticket." The flight attendant's tone grew sharper. "Listen, sweetheart. I don't know how you ended up with this ticket, but you need to move to the back. You're holding up the boarding process." The words stung, not just because of what she said, but how she said it, loud, dismissive, as if Zara Collins were some kind of problem. Passengers nearby started whispering. Some looked away, pretending not to notice, while others watched with curiosity. The murmur of discontent in the cabin seemed to grow as the tension mounted, filling the narrow aisle with an uncomfortable energy that made every second feel drawn out and heavy. Zara Collins felt her face grow warm, her pride crumbling under the weight of humiliation. She wasn't a troublemaker, and she didn't want to cause a scene, but this wasn't fair. Still, she gathered her things quietly, refusing to let tears fall. She could feel the stares following her as she walked down the aisle toward the economy section, her heart pounding with embarrassment. Miss Elise didn't offer to help. She just stood there, her face set in a smug expression, satisfied that she had corrected the situation. The journey from first class to the back felt like a public shaming, each step echoing with the judgment of unseen eyes and harsh whispers. Zara Collins found an empty seat near the back of the plane. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she stuffed her backpack under the seat again. She stared out the small window, fighting back the lump in her throat. She wasn't going to cry. She wouldn't give anyone that satisfaction. After a few minutes, she pulled out her phone and typed a message to her father. "Dad, they made me leave my seat even though I had the ticket. The flight attendant was really rude. I'm in the back now." She hit send, slipped her phone back into her bag, and stared out the window, her face calm, but inside her mind raced with a mix of anger, disbelief, and a resolve that simmered beneath her quiet exterior. She didn't know what would happen next, but something told her this wasn't over. Not even close. Zara Collins sat in the cramped economy seat, gripping the armrest tightly. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, yet her mind was overwhelmed by the relentless replay of events that had just unfolded. Every detail, the cold glare of disapproval, the hushed murmurs of nearby passengers, seemed etched into her memory. She knew she had done nothing wrong. She had her ticket, she had followed every rule, and yet she was made to feel like an unwelcome intruder. Frustration churned in her stomach, but she summoned the inner calm her father had always urged her to embrace, insisting that patience and control trumped the fleeting fire of anger. In that moment of quiet resolve, her phone vibrated in her lap, jolting her back to the present. Quickly, she unlocked the screen and saw her father's message flash. "What do you mean they made you move?" After a brief pause filled with uncertainty, she carefully typed back, recounting in simple words, "I couldn't sit in first class and they made me move to the back." Moments later, his next message arrived. "What's the flight number?" Zara's heart began to beat faster as she recognized that even through text, his tone carried a storm of anger carefully veiled behind measured words. Anger he never allowed to show outright. He was not the type to shout or lose his temper. Instead, he always managed matters with a quiet authority that commanded respect. Instantly, she double-checked her boarding pass and sent him the flight number along with a reassuring directive. "Stay where you are. Don't worry about anything." Although she exhaled slowly and placed her phone down with a forced calm, a storm of uncertainty brewed inside her. She trusted her father implicitly, yet she wondered what measures he could possibly take now that the plane was already soaring through the skies, and Miss Elise had made it abundantly clear that her presence in first class was unacceptable. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Miss Elise strode confidently back to the galley, evidently pleased with her own decisive actions. She poured herself a quick cup of coffee, dismissing the sidelong glances and murmured comments from the other flight attendants. One of them, a younger woman named Iris, paused before speaking. In a cautious tone, "Was there really an issue with that girl's ticket?" she asked. Miss Elise rolled her eyes. "You saw her, didn't you? She didn't look like a first-class passenger, probably a mistake in the system, or maybe she got the ticket from someone else." Either way, I wasn't about to let her sit up here when she clearly didn't belong. Iris frowned but said nothing. She knew better than to argue with Miss Elise, who had been with the airline for years and had a reputation for being strict, but something about the situation didn't sit right with her. Back in the main cabin, Zara Collins sat quietly, staring at the seatbelt sign. Deep in thought, she couldn't shake the unsettling intuition that her father's next move would be as dramatic as the error just committed by the flight attendant. Miss Elise, meanwhile, moved briskly through the first-class cabin, meticulously straightening trays and offering drinks, her demeanor cool and unruffled, as if the earlier incident were nothing more than routine. To her, it was simply another instance of enforcing the rules, a minor correction for a passenger who didn't quite fit the expected profile. Yet beneath her practiced efficiency, a faint twinge of doubt stirred, hinting that perhaps this time her judgment might have been flawed. As she refilled a passenger's glass with deliberate care, the intercom suddenly crackled to life. "Miss Elise, please report to the cockpit immediately." Her hand froze momentarily before she quickly set the bottle down, glancing around at a cabin that seemed indifferent to the interruption. With a composed smile masking her inner uncertainty, she straightened her uniform and began a measured walk toward the front. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The captain turned to look at her with a serious expression, and on the in-flight phone screen, a flight manager from the executive office appeared, his face unreadable but his tone firm. "Miss Elise, we've received a call from the executive office. There's a situation on board that requires clarification. A first-class passenger was removed from her seat. Can you explain why?" Miss Elise's confidence wavered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "Yes, Captain. A young girl was in first class with a ticket that didn't match her status. I asked her to move to economy." The man on the screen blinked, his expression darkening. "Did you check the validity of her ticket before making her move?" Miss Elise hesitated. "Well, yes, but yes or no?" The manager interrupted. His mouth went dry. "I checked it, but I didn't think." The captain's jaw tightened. "You didn't think what?" Before she could answer, the manager continued in a colder voice. "Now, the girl you removed is Zara Collins. Do you know who her father is?" Miss Elise shook her head slowly, suddenly feeling a strange sense of unease creeping up her spine. "Her father is Ethan Miller," the manager said flatly, "the owner of this airline." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Immediately, the shock coursed through her veins as the realization sank in and the color drained from her face. The captain didn't look surprised. He had already been briefed. "We have direct orders from Mr. Miller himself. You will return to Zara Collins, personally apologize in front of the passengers, and escort her back to first class. And when this flight lands, you will be required to explain yourself in front of the executive board." Miss Elise felt her throat tighten. She had humiliated the daughter of the most powerful man in the airline industry, and she had done it in front of a cabin full of passengers. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a career-ending disaster, understood the manager in a voice like ice. Miss Elise swallowed hard and nodded, though her hands trembled as the gravity of her error began to weigh on her. "Good," the captain said. "Now fix your mistake without another word." Miss Elise turned and walked out of the cockpit, her legs feeling strangely weak for the first time in her career. Every step reverberated with the bitter sting of regret as she grappled with the reality that she had lost control of the situation and had no idea what was going to happen next. Stepping into the narrow corridor, her breath came faster than usual and her mind raced with a mix of dread and disbelief. She replayed the incident over and over, questioning every decision that led her here. The heavy silence of the cabin, punctuated by curious stares from passengers who had witnessed her falter, intensified the crushing burden of her mistake. With each step, the sound of her footsteps seemed to echo the magnitude of the error, a misstep that threatened to upend her entire career and reputation. Her thoughts churned relentlessly as she trudged towards the economy section, trying to muster the courage to face the consequences of her actions. She reached the economy section, scanning the rows until she spotted Zara Collins sitting by the window, staring outside, her hands folded in her lap. Clearing her throat, Miss Elise forced a tight smile and crouched slightly to be at eye level. In a lower but still forced tone, she said, "There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat in first class." Zara Collins turned to look at her, her expression unreadable. She didn't move right away. Ms. Elise's skin prickled under the weight of the silence. She could feel the nearby passengers listening in, waiting to see what would happen next. "I apologize for any inconvenience," Miss Elise added quickly, her voice strained. Zara Collins blinked, then tilted her head slightly. "You're saying it was a misunderstanding?" Ms. Elise nodded stiffly. "Yes, there was." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. An error in seating, the best excuse she could come up with? She couldn't bring herself to admit what really happened. Zara Collins studied her for a long moment before responding, her voice soft but firm. "I had my ticket, you saw it, and you still told me to move." A couple of passengers nearby exchanged looks. They had heard everything earlier and knew Zara Collins was right. Miss Elise swallowed hard. "I may have made a mistake in judgment," she said carefully, "but I'd like to correct it now. Please, come with me." Zara Collins didn't say anything right away. She could feel the weight of the moment. She could get up and return to first class like nothing happened. She could let it go, but why should she? She picked up her phone and tapped out a quick message to her father. "She's asking me to come back now. What should I do?" The reply came almost instantly. "Take your time. Make her understand what she did." Zara Collins slipped the phone back into her bag and looked at Miss Elise again. "I'll go back," she said calmly, "but I want to know why you thought I didn't belong there." Miss Elise stiffened. I didn't think, but you did," she stammered. Zara Collins interrupted, her voice steady, not angry, just firm. "You didn't ask anyone else in first class for their ticket, just me. Why?" Miss Elise opened her mouth, then shut it again. The passengers around them were dead silent, all waiting for her answer. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to being questioned. Zara Collins stood up slowly, keeping her eyes on the flight attendant. "If you're going to apologize, at least tell the truth." Miss Elise's face burned. She had spent years controlling situations like this, making the rules, keeping things in order. But now she wasn't in control at all. She had never expected a teenager to hold this much power over her. She took a shaky breath. I misjudged you." Zara Collins didn't say anything. She let the words sit there, letting Miss Elise feel their weight. Then, without another word, she picked up her backpack and walked past her. The walk back to first class wasn't a victory march. It wasn't smug or arrogant. It was quiet, dignified, and somehow that made it even more powerful. The first-class passengers turned as Zara Collins entered. Some looking surprised, others quickly looking away, embarrassed that they had witnessed the earlier humiliation and done nothing. Miss Elise followed behind, feeling smaller with every step. Zara Collins reached her seat, sat down, and calmly placed her bag beside her. She didn't thank Miss Elise. She didn't need to. Miss Elise stood there, awkwardly uncertain what to say next. "If there's anything you need," she mumbled, "please let me know." Zara Collins simply opened her book and flipped to the next page, her silence making it clear that this conversation was over. Miss Elise turned stiffly and hurried back toward the galley, her face burning with humiliation. She had never felt so exposed before, so completely stripped of authority. She had spent years making quick judgments about passengers, and it had never backfired like this. But this time, she hadn't just offended any passenger. She had humiliated the daughter of the most powerful man in the airline business. The other flight attendants in the galley exchanged glances as she entered. They had all heard about what happened, and their silence was louder than any words they could have spoken. Iris, the younger attendant who had questioned her earlier, hesitated before speaking. "Everything okay?" she asked carefully. Miss Elise shot her a sharp look, her voice tight. "It's fine, but it wasn't fine, not even close." She grabbed a tray and pretended to busy herself with arranging drinks, but her hands were trembling slightly. The reality of the situation was sinking in. The passengers had seen everything. They had watched her remove that girl from first class, and they had watched her escort her back in shame, and now she could feel their eyes on her every time she stepped into the aisle. Meanwhile, in first class, Zara Collins sat back in her seat, flipping the pages of her book. But she wasn't really reading. She could still feel the tension in the air. The same people who had ignored her earlier were now stealing glances at her, as if they had suddenly realized they were sitting next to someone important. But that wasn't what bothered her the most. What bothered her was that none of them had spoken up when it happened. She reached for her phone and checked her messages. Another text from her father had come in. "Good, now sit back and relax. I'll handle the rest." She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but she trusted him. At the front of the plane, the in-flight phone buzzed again. Miss Elise flinched at the sound. She knew who it was before she even picked it up. She lifted the receiver to her ear. "This is Miss Elise," a deep, calm voice spoke on the other end. "This is Ethan Miller." She gripped the phone tighter. His voice wasn't raised, it wasn't angry, but there was something in his tone that made the air feel heavier. "You will personally file a full incident report as soon as this flight lands. I expect a detailed explanation of why my daughter was removed from her seat despite having a valid ticket." Miss Elise swallowed hard. "Mr. Miller," she began, "you will also make sure that for the rest of this flight she receives exactly the service that every other first-class passenger gets, nothing less." "Yes, sir," she whispered. The call ended with a soft click. Miss Elise placed the phone back on the hook and leaned against the counter, her hands clammy. She had made a serious mistake, one she couldn't take back. And now she wasn't just dealing with a difficult passenger, she was dealing with the man who owned the sky she was flying in. Miss Elise stood frozen in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter. She had handled difficult situations before, but this was different. This wasn't about a minor seating mistake or a passenger being a little too demanding. This was about her making a decision, one she had been so sure of in the moment, only to realize it was based on nothing but her own assumptions. And now she was paying the price for it. Her uniform suddenly felt too tight. Her usually pristine posture slightly slumped. She could feel the glances of the other flight attendants, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air. No one said it out loud, but she could hear it in their silence. "You messed up, and now you're on your own." Taking a deep breath, she straightened up and grabbed a tray. If she was going to get through the rest of this flight, she needed to act as if nothing had happened. She stepped back into the first-class cabin, trying to maintain her usual authority, but the moment she did, she felt the shift. Passengers who had once barely acknowledged her presence now looked at her with something different. Some with quiet amusement, others with curiosity, and a few with clear disapproval. She didn't know which was worse. She forced herself to walk towards Zara Collins's seat. The girl sat comfortably now, flipping through the in-flight magazine. Her posture was calm. She wasn't gloating, and she wasn't even looking at Miss Elise, and somehow that made it worse. Miss Elise cleared her throat. "Miss Elise," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "can I offer you something to drink, maybe a snack?" Zara Collins didn't look up immediately. She turned a page slowly, then finally met the flight attendant's gaze. "A drink?" she asked in an even voice. "Yes, Miss Elise," came the quick reply. "Anything you'd like. We have fresh juice, sparkling water, tea." Zara Collins tilted her head slightly. "You didn't ask me that before," she said, still calm. "You didn't offer me anything. You didn't even greet me properly like you did with the other first-class passengers." She glanced around the cabin. "But now, you're offering." Ms. Elise felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She was used to controlling conversations, used to being the one setting the tone, but this was something entirely different. She forced a tight smile. I apologize if I wasn't as welcoming before. I assure you it wasn't intentional." Zara Collins didn't say anything for a moment. She simply watched Miss Elise, her eyes sharp yet unreadable. Then, after a pause, she gave a small shrug. "I'll have a sparkling water." Miss Elise nodded quickly, relieved to have something to do rather than just stand there under the weight of this conversation. She turned and hurried back to the galley, her hands gripping the tray a little too tightly. Iris, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "That didn't go well, did it?" Miss Elise shot her a glare. "I don't need your input right now." Iris raised her hands in surrender, but she couldn't hide the hint of satisfaction in her expression. "I'm just saying, you handled that better than you did." Ms. Elise didn't respond. She quickly poured a glass of sparkling water, making sure the tray was perfect before walking back to Zara Collins's seat. She placed the glass carefully on the tray table, hoping the moment would pass without another comment. But Zara Collins wasn't done. "Thank you," she said, then paused. "By the way, I texted my dad about you." The words sent a fresh wave of dread through Miss Elise's stomach. She forced a small, tight smile. "I see." Zara Collins leaned back, watching her. "Yeah, he wasn't happy." Miss Elise already knew that. She had heard his voice on the phone not long ago. But hearing Zara Collins say it so casually, with that quiet confidence, made her stomach turn even more. "I guess we'll see what happens when we land," Zara Collins added, picking up her water and taking a slow sip. Miss Elise stiffened, nodding quickly before retreating back toward the front of the cabin. She had never wanted a flight to end so badly in her entire career, but she had a sinking feeling that her problems were only just beginning. Stepping back into the galley, Miss Elise felt an uneasy tightness in her chest. Her breath was shallow. She had thought that escorting Zara Collins back to first class would fix everything. She had thought that a forced apology, a free drink, and a little politeness would be enough to smooth things over. But the look in that girl's eyes, the calm confidence, the way she didn't need to raise her voice or argue, made it clear that this situation wasn't going away. For the first time in her long career, Miss Elise felt powerless. She had always been the one in control, the one who made the rules inside the aircraft. She decided who got upgraded, who got extra service, who was treated with priority. It had never occurred to her that one mistake could flip everything upside down. But now she could feel the weight of it pressing on her like a stone in her stomach. A quiet voice broke through her thoughts. "You're really sweating this, huh?" Miss Elise turned sharply. Iris was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and pity. "Mind your business," Miss Elise snapped, grabbing a napkin and pretending to busy herself. Iris smirked. "It is my business. You embarrassed that girl in front of a plane full of people. And now it turns out her dad owns the airline. I'd be sweating too if I were you, Miss Elise." She clenched her jaw. "It was an honest mistake, was it?" Iris asked, her voice dropping slightly. "Because I don't remember you questioning anyone else about their ticket, just her." Miss Elise turned away, gripping the edge of the counter. "I don't have time for this conversation." "Fine," Iris said with a shrug. "But I'd start thinking about what you're going to say when we land, because Mr. Miller, he doesn't seem like the type to let this slide." Miss Elise didn't answer. She couldn't, because she already knew Iris was right. Meanwhile, Zara Collins sat comfortably in her first-class seat, sipping her sparkling water. She wasn't enjoying the drink as much as she was enjoying the shift in energy around her. The people who had ignored her before were suddenly acknowledging her. Their glances were filled with curiosity, guilt, or quiet embarrassment. Some passengers seemed uncomfortable, shifting in their seats or pretending to be engrossed in their books. Others avoided looking at her altogether. She didn't blame them. No one had spoken up when she was being humiliated, and now they were realizing they had been bystanders. A man in the seat across from her, an older gentleman in a navy suit, leaned over slightly. I saw what happened earlier," he said hesitantly. "That was unfortunate." Zara Collins turned to look at him, raising an eyebrow. "Unfortunate?" The man cleared his throat. "Yes, well, it was clearly a mistake on the flight attendant's part." Zara Collins studied him for a moment, then gave a small smile. "A mistake," she repeated, "or a choice?" The man shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the stem of his wineglass. "Well, I suppose," he trailed off, clearly unsure of what to say. Zara Collins let the silence stretch between them for a few seconds before she turned back to her magazine, dismissing him with her indifference. She wasn't interested in making him feel better about what had happened. Her phone vibrated again. She picked it up and read the message. "Dad, we land in 45 minutes. Sit tight." She smiled slightly. "Oh, I will," she thought. Up in the cockpit, Troy was fully aware of the situation unfolding in his aircraft. He had been in the business long enough to know when something was going to turn into a scandal, and this had scandal written all over it. He reached for the in-flight phone and dialed the ground operations team. "This is Troy, Flight 372, he said smoothly. "I need confirmation on executive arrangements for a passenger upon landing." There was a pause before a voice on the other end responded, "Yes, Captain. Mr. Miller has already arranged for a private car to meet his daughter at the gate. Security has also been notified to escort a specific crew member for questioning." Troy, already knowing exactly who that crew member was, replied, "Understood. Inform the crew to prepare for immediate disembarkation procedures." "Will do, sir." Troy hung up the phone and leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. He had been flying for over 20 years and he had seen a lot. Angry passengers, entitled executives, and crew members who let their egos make bad decisions. But this was one of those rare times when he knew someone's career was about to crash harder than a failed landing. and Miss Elise had no idea how bad it was going to get. Back in first class, Miss Elise walked stiffly through the aisle, checking on passengers, but her movements lacked their usual confidence. She could feel her own crew watching her, their expressions unreadable. She had no idea what was waiting for her when they landed, but she knew one thing for sure. She had made a mistake that couldn't be undone, and the consequences were waiting for her just beyond on the runway. The plane hummed steadily as it cruised through the sky, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted completely. First-class passengers who once carried themselves with a sense of self-importance were now sitting tensely, sneaking glances at Zara Collins. The girl who had been invisible to them earlier had suddenly become the center of attention, not because she had asked for it, but because of the undeniable power she now held. Zara Collins didn't do anything dramatic. She didn't raise her voice or demand extra service. She simply existed in her seat with quiet confidence, sipping her sparkling water, scrolling through her phone, and occasionally glancing out the window. It was her presence that unsettled people. They weren't used to being held accountable for what they ignored. She was calm on the outside, but on the inside she was processing everything. She replayed the way Miss Elise had dismissed her, the way passengers had avoided eye contact, the way no one had spoken up. She thought about the way her father had responded, how he hadn't immediately reacted with anger but with controlled precision. She checked her phone again. "Dad, we land in 30 minutes. Let me know if you need anything before then." She smiled slightly. "Me? I'm good, just watching things unfold." She set the phone down and leaned back in her seat, stretching her arms slightly. The fact that Miss Elise hadn't dared to come back since delivering her drink told her everything she needed to know. The flight attendant was scrambling to figure out what to do next, and Zara Collins wasn't worried at all. Miss Elise, however, was panicking. She stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The tension in her shoulders had built up so much that her neck ached. She had avoided going back to first class as much as possible, choosing instead to let the other attendants handle everything, but that wasn't going to save her. Iris watched her from the corner of the galley, arms crossed, with an unreadable expression on her face. She had been working under Miss Elise for a while now, and she had never seen her like this, shaken, uncertain, weak. "You should probably sit down before you collapse," Iris muttered. Miss Elise shot her a glare. "I don't need your comments right now." Iris shrugged. "Fine, but I hope you're ready for what's coming, because in about half an hour you're going to be walking off this plane, and I doubt you'll be walking back onto another one anytime soon." Miss Elise's stomach twisted. She had been trying not to think about that, but then Iris added, "Maybe they'll let you apologize again. Seems to be working so well for you." Miss Elise clenched her jaw, swallowing down the bitter lump in her throat. She wasn't stupid. She knew what was coming. She had spent years in the airline industry, carefully crafting a reputation as a tough but respected senior flight attendant. She had always prided herself on being in control, on keeping things professional, but now none of that mattered. She had made a mistake that couldn't be brushed aside, and the worst part was that it wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of something deeper, something uglier, something she had never been forced to confront before. And now she was paying the price for it. The minutes ticked by slowly. Zara Collins could feel the descent beginning as the plane tilted slightly downward. A voice crackled over the intercom. The captain, speaking in his usual calm tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into our destination. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. We'll be landing shortly." She reached down, buckled her seatbelt, and stole a glance toward the front of the plane. Miss Elise still hadn't returned, and at this point, Zara Collins doubted she would. Instead, she focused on what was ahead. She wasn't sure what her father had planned, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just going to be a private conversation. This was bigger than her, bigger than Miss Elise. This was about how people in power treated those they thought had none. And today, they had miscalculated. The plane continued its descent, the runway coming into view through the small window beside her. Zara Collins exhaled slowly, bracing for what was to come. She was ready, but she wasn't sure Miss Elise was. The descent was steady, but inside the cabin the tension grew heavier with each passing second. Zara Collins could sense it not just from the flight attendants, but from the passengers as well. The ones who had stayed silent when she was humiliated now seemed uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, suddenly too interested in their in-flight entertainment or the safety pamphlets in their seat pockets. It was strange how quickly things changed. A few hours ago, she had been invisible to them. Now they were hyper-aware of her presence, though no one dared to say a word. Ms. Elise remained out of sight, likely hiding in the galley, hoping to delay the inevitable. Zara Collins knew what was coming for her, and it wasn't going to be a private slap on the wrist. No, her father didn't believe in quiet punishments. He believed in accountability, and he made sure it was handled publicly. As the wheels of the plane finally touched the runway, a hushed stillness settled over the passengers. The usual rush of excitement when landing wasn't there. Instead, there was something else: anticipation. People weren't just ready to get off the plane, they were waiting to see what would happen next. The intercom buzzed again, and the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today." Zara Collins glanced down at her phone and saw another text from her father. "Dad, stay seated. Security is waiting at the gate." Her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Miss Elise, however, wasn't smiling. She stood in the galley, gripping the edge of the counter, her palms slick with sweat. Every part of her screamed to pull herself together, to walk off the plane like nothing had happened, but she knew better. She had spent years working in this industry and had never seen something escalate this quickly. This wasn't just about a complaint. It was about the owner of the airline personally making sure she was held responsible, and she had no idea what that would mean for her future. Iris stood a few feet away, watching her with an unreadable expression. She didn't say anything at first, just observed the woman who had spent years acting like she was untouchable. Then finally she spoke. "You know, if you had just treated her like every other first-class passenger, none of this would be happening right now." Miss Elise turned sharply, her eyes flashing. "I don't need a lecture." Iris shrugged. "I think you do, but it does. Doesn't matter, you'll get one soon enough." Miss Elise's stomach churned as the seatbelt sign dinged, the doors unlocked, and then everything changed. A uniformed security officer stepped onto the plane. His presence alone was enough to silence the small conversations that were happening. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an authority that made it clear this was not a routine visit. Passengers in the first few rows stiffened their curiosity, and flight attendants stood frozen, unsure of what to do, but the officer wasn't looking for them. He was looking for one person: Miss Elise. The sound of her name sent a chill down her spine. Slowly, stiffly, she stepped forward. The officer's face was unreadable as he said, "You'll need to come with us." A few passengers audibly gasped. Others pretended not to watch, though their ears were fully tuned in. Miss Elise swallowed, forcing a tight, professional smile. "Is there a problem?" she asked. The officer didn't blink. "There have been reports of an incident regarding the removal of a first-class passenger. Mr. Miller has requested a formal review. You'll need to come with us for questioning." The moment was surreal. Miss Elise had always been the one with the authority, the one giving instructions, enforcing rules, making passengers feel small when necessary. And now she was the one being escorted off the plane. Her feet felt like lead as she walked down the aisle. The murmurs around her grew, the whispers of passengers spreading like wildfire. She avoided eye contact, but she could feel them looking at her. She had never felt so small in her life. As she reached the first-class section, she made the mistake of glancing at Zara Collins. The girl wasn't smug, she wasn't grinning or gloating. She was simply watching, calm, composed, unmoved. And that was worse. Miss Elise tore her gaze away and kept walking as she stepped off the plane. The weight of everything truly settled in. She had lost control, lost her position, lost the respect she had always commanded, and now she had to face the consequences for the first time. She wasn't sure if she was ready. The moment Miss Elise stepped off the plane, the bright lights of the terminal felt like a spotlight shining directly on her. The security officers led her through the jet bridge, their pace steady but firm. She could feel the weight of every step and the murmurs of airport staff and passengers growing louder as people turned to watch. She had walked through this airport countless times, always with confidence, always in control. But now she felt exposed, like a criminal being paraded through the crowd. At the end of the jet bridge, two airline executives stood waiting, their expressions unreadable, their arms crossed in silent judgment. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a sharp suit, stepped forward. "Miss Elise," he said in a cool but professional voice, "come with us." She swallowed hard, nodding stiffly. The officers stepped aside, allowing the executives to take over. She followed them through a restricted door leading into the private corridors of the airport. The area's regular passengers never saw these walls. They were sterile, and the air was thick with the smell of coffee and jet fuel. Finally, they reached a small conference room. Inside, a long table stretched across the center with a few chairs neatly arranged. The walls were bare except for the airline's logo printed behind the head seat. One of the executives gestured toward a chair. "Sit." Miss Elise hesitated for a split second before obeying. The silver-hailed man took the seat across from her, clasping his hands together. His name tag read Calvin York, Senior Operations Manager. She had met him once before, in passing, but now he looked at her with nothing but cold scrutiny. "You do realize why you're here, correct?" he asked. Miss Elise straightened in her seat, trying to regain whatever authority she had left. "I was informed there was a complaint about a seating issue." "Seating issue?" Calvin York repeated, his voice carrying a slight edge. "Miss Elise, do you understand who you removed from first class?" She forced herself to hold his gaze. "I do." "Now, do you?" Calvin York tilted his head slightly. "Because this isn't just about a mistake. This is about how that mistake happened." Miss Elise's fingers curled around the arms of the chair. "I didn't mean..." "You didn't mean to humiliate the daughter of the airline's owner," Calvin York interrupted. "Or you didn't mean to assume she didn't belong in first class." Her throat tightened as silence stretched between them. Calvin York leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Let's be clear, Miss Elise. This is not about a simple seating mix-up. If it were, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. This is about why you questioned her ticket when you didn't question anyone else's. This is about why you spoke to her in a tone you wouldn't have used on another passenger." Ms. Elise's jaw clenched. I was just following protocol." Calvin York scoffed, shaking his head. "No, you weren't. Protocol requires that if there's an issue with seating, you check the manifest first. You didn't do that, did you, Miss Elise?" She stayed silent. "You also didn't radio the gate agent to verify the ticket," he continued. "You made a decision based purely on assumption, and then, to make matters worse, you spoke down to a minor in front of the entire first-class cabin." Miss Elise felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wanted to defend herself, to say that it wasn't that serious, that it wasn't intentional, but how could she argue when the evidence was stacked against her? Calvin York exhaled through his nose, leaning back in his chair. "You've been with this airline for how long?" 10 years, she answered quietly. 10 years, he repeated. "That's a long time. Long enough to know how things work. Long enough to know better." His words hit harder than she expected. Calvin York pulled out a folder and flipped it open. Inside were documents, statements from passengers, a report from the captain, and, worst of all, a printed complaint directly from Ethan Miller himself. Calvin York tapped the paper with 2 fingers. "Mr. Miller has already made it clear that this incident will not be ignored." Miss Elise's breath hitched. "What do that mean?" "It means," Calvin York said evenly, "that as of now, you are suspended without pay pending a full review by the board." Her stomach dropped. "Suspended?" "Yes," his tone remained cold. "A final decision will be made within the week, but I wouldn't be optimistic if I were you." Miss Elise's hands trembled slightly. "I've given 10 years to this airline. You can't just—" Calvin York's eyes darkened. "Miss Elise, if this were any other passenger, we'd still be having this conversation. The only difference is it wouldn't be just suspension, it would be immediate termination." Her mouth opened, then closed. Calvin York sighed, rubbing his temple. "I'm going to be honest with you. You might have a chance to appeal if you take full accountability, if you admit your mistake and show that you're willing to learn from it. But if you sit here making excuses and defending yourself, then this is the end of your career in aviation." Miss Elise swallowed hard. She had spent years building her reputation, climbing the ranks, thinking she was untouchable. But now, everything she had worked for was hanging by a thread. Calvin York studied her for a moment before closing the folder. "That's all for now. You'll be escorted out of the airport. A formal letter will be sent to your email by tomorrow." He stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. Miss Elise still stood frozen in shock. Slowly she rose from her seat. Her knees felt weak. She wanted to argue, to demand another chance, but she knew it wouldn't matter. A security officer stepped back into the room, waiting to escort her out. As she turned to leave, Calvin York spoke one last time. "Maybe next time, before you judge someone by how they look," he said coolly, "you'll think twice." Miss Elise didn't reply. She walked out of the room, her head low and her stomach twisted in knots. For the first time in 10 years, she had no idea what her future looked like. Miss Elise walked through the airport terminal in a daze, each step feeling heavier than the last. The security officer at her side didn't speak or offer any words of comfort or reassurance. There was nothing to say. She had heard her fate loud and clear, and the reality of it was settling in like a lead weight in her chest, suspended without pay. Her hands clenched into fists as she navigated through the terminal, ignoring the stares from passing employees and travelers. Some people had already heard what happened. News like this traveled fast in the airline industry, especially when it involved someone as powerful as Ethan Miller. She had always walked through these halls with a sense of authority, head held high, her uniform pristine. But now she felt like an outsider. When she reached the exit doors, she hesitated. The airport was her second home. She had spent years inside these walls, working tirelessly to make sure flights ran smoothly and ensuring passengers followed the rules. But now, she was the one being removed like a problem that needed to be handled. She wasn't ready for this. The security officer cleared his throat, gesturing toward the exit without another word. She stepped outside, the cool air hitting her skin as the doors slid shut behind her. The noise of the city filled her ears. Honking cars, distant chatter, the hum of planes overhead. She had never felt more alone. Inside the airport, things were moving quickly. Zara Collins sat in the first-class lounge, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp. She had been escorted there shortly after the plane landed at her father's request. The lounge was quiet and elegant, filled with plush leather chairs and warm lighting. A few passengers were scattered around, sipping coffee and checking their phones, oblivious to the storm that had just passed through the terminal. She wasn't waiting long. A few minutes later, the glass doors slid open and in walked the man she had been waiting for. Ethan Miller carried himself with the same quiet authority he always had. Tall, well-dressed. His presence alone commanded respect. He was a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His words carried weight simply because of who he was. As he approached, Zara Collins stood with a small smile tugging at her lips. "Hey, Dad," she said. He gave her a long look, then sighed, pulling her into a brief but firm hug. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I'm good," he replied, pulling back and studying her face to make sure she wasn't just saying that to make him feel better. "They didn't mess with you after you went back to first class?" she asked. He smirked. "Nope, I think they were too scared." Ethan Miller exhaled, shaking his head. They both sat down, the tension in the air finally beginning to ease. Folding his hands in front of him, he said, "Tell me everything." Zara Collins recounted the entire story. The moment Miss Elise approached her, the way she had dismissed her ticket, the humiliation of being forced to move. She kept her tone even, never exaggerating, never making it more dramatic than it needed to be. Her father listened intently, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt or react with sudden anger, but Zara Collins knew him well enough to see the fire burning behind his eyes. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, then finally spoke. "She's suspended," he said simply, "indefinitely." Zara Collins raised an eyebrow. "Just suspended?" He met her gaze for a moment, and she considered that he was giving her a chance to explain herself. He nodded. "I believe in accountability, but I also believe in fairness. She needs to own up to what she did. If she does, then maybe she can fix herself. If she doesn't, then she won't work for this airline ever again." Zara Collins leaned back in her chair, processing that. "Do you think she will own up to it?" Ethan Miller exhaled, rubbing his chin. Some people don't learn until they lose everything. She thought about Miss Elise's face when she had come to apologize, the tension in her voice, the way she had tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding. It wasn't, it was a choice, a bad one. "She won't get her job back," Zara Collins said confidently. "People like her never admit they were wrong." Ethan Miller gave a small, thoughtful nod. "We'll see." He glanced at his watch. "I have a meeting with the board in an hour. We're going to implement new policies because of this." Zara Collins raised an eyebrow. "New policies?" Her father nodded. "Bias training, more oversight on first-class treatment, and a stronger system for passengers to report discrimination. This isn't just about you," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Zara Collins felt a strange sense of pride settle in her chest. This wasn't just about punishing Ms. Elise. It was about change. She picked up her drink, taking a slow sip. "So basically, you just helped make the airline better," she observed. Ethan Miller chuckled, shaking his head. "Ironic, isn't it?" Zara Collins smirked. "Karma's funny like that." Her father's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then sighed. "They're ready for me." He stood up, adjusting his suit. "You coming with me or heading home?" Zara Collins stretched, standing as well. "I think I'll stick around. I want to see what happens next." Ethan Miller smiled. "That's my girl." They walked out of the lounge together, side by side, the weight of the day settling behind them. But for Miss Elise, her storm was just beginning. Ms. Elise sat on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the airline-issued tablet that still rested on her nightstand. The same tablet she had used for years to check passenger lists, seating charts, and company memos. Now it was useless to her. She had been locked out of the system the moment her suspension was finalized. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers twitching slightly as she tried to process everything. 10 years. 10 years of early morning flights, late night layovers, missed holidays, and endless hours in the sky. 10 years of controlling the cabin, enforcing rules, making sure everything ran her way. And now, it had taken less than 10 minutes to destroy all of it. She glanced at her phone. Her email was still open. The official suspension letter had arrived just moments ago. Cold and impersonal subject. Suspension notification from Airline Executive Board. Dear Miss Elise, effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid suspension pending a formal review regarding conduct on Flight 3272D. A disciplinary hearing will be scheduled, and you will be notified of further actions. Until further notice, you are prohibited from accessing airline facilities or performing duties in any capacity. Failure to comply with these conditions may result in immediate termination. Further instructions will be provided within 72 hours. Regards, Airline Executive Board. Miss Elise exhaled sharply, her grip tightening around the phone. This isn't happening, she thought, but it is. And the worst part was that she had no one to blame but herself. For the first few hours after leaving the airport, she had been angry, furious at the way she had been treated, embarrassed by how quickly things had spiraled out of her control. But now, sitting alone in her small apartment, the anger had started to shift. For the first time since the flight, she allowed herself to really think about what had happened. Not the punishment, not the fallout, just the moment itself. The moment she had looked at that girl, Zara Collins, and assumed without hesitation that she didn't belong. It wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. And now it was costing her everything. A lump formed in her throat. She reached for a glass of water on the nightstand, but her hands were unsteady. She set it back down before it could spill. She could fight it. She could argue, claiming she had just been doing her job, but deep down she knew no matter how much she tried to justify it, she had done something that wasn't just unprofessional, it was wrong. And Ethan Miller had made sure she wouldn't get away with it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden buzz from her phone. A new email notification popped up on her screen. Her stomach twisted when she saw the sender. Ethan Miller. For a moment, she just stared at it, unsure if she had the courage to open it. Her thumb hovered over the screen before finally tapping the message. Subject: accountability. Miss Elise, I'm sure by now you understand the severity of what happened on Flight 372. I won't waste time repeating what's already been made clear by the board. However, I believe in people taking responsibility for their actions, and that includes giving them a chance to acknowledge their mistakes. I am giving you that chance now. If you wish to formally apologize to my daughter, I will make sure she receives your message. However, I want to be clear. This apology isn't for me, it isn't for the airline, it isn't for your career. It is for the person you wronged. If you can't bring yourself to do that, then I see no reason for this conversation to continue. I'll wait for your response. Ethan Miller. Ms. Elise let out a slow breath as she reread the email. A part of her wanted to delete it, ignore it, walk away from this whole mess and blame it on anyone but herself. But another part of her, one she wasn't used to listening to, told her that this was her only shot at salvaging even a fraction of her dignity. She hesitated for a long time before finally pressing reply. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then slowly she began to type. Subject: re-accountability. Mr. Miller, I don't expect forgiveness, and I won't make excuses. I made a terrible mistake. I didn't just misjudge your daughter. I disrespected her, and worse, I didn't realize it until it was too late. I have spent the last 10 years enforcing rules, thinking I was doing my job the right way. But now I understand that I let my personal bias influence my actions, whether I intended it or not. That is something I will have to live with. I would like the opportunity to apologize to Zara Collins directly, but I understand that is entirely her choice. If she doesn't want to hear from me, I accept that. No matter what happens next, I will take full responsibility for my actions. I am sorry. Miss Elise. She stared at the message for a long time before finally pressing send. As soon as it left her inbox, she set her phone down and leaned back, closing her eyes for the first time in days. She felt something shift. The storm wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward making things right. Meanwhile, Zara Collins sat in her father's office, legs crossed, scrolling through her phone while waiting for him to finish his call. She had spent the past few days watching the fallout of what had happened on Flight 372, seeing articles pop up online about airline discrimination, discussions on social media, and even a few industry experts weighing in on what changes needed to be made. She wasn't surprised. Her father had a reputation for handling things with precision. When something went wrong in his company, he didn't just fix it, he changed the system so it wouldn't happen again. And this time, that meant major policy changes, mandatory bias training, increased oversight in first-class treatment. The airline wasn't just apologizing, it was evolving. And it was all because of one flight, one moment, one bad decision from a woman who had let her assumptions control her actions. Her phone buzzed with a new email notification. Zara Collins glanced at the sender, her eyebrows lifting slightly when she saw it was from Miss Elise. For a moment, she just stared at it. She wasn't sure how she felt about hearing from the woman who had humiliated her, but curiosity got the better of her, and she opened the message. Subject: my apology. Zara Collins, I know I don't deserve your time and I won't waste it with excuses. You didn't deserve what I did to you. You weren't wrong. You weren't out of place when I told you to move. I wasn't thinking about rules or policies. I was thinking about what I expected to see in first class. And when I didn't see it, I acted without thought. That wasn't just unprofessional, it was unfair, and I am deeply ashamed of that. I can't change what I did, but I can promise that I will never let myself make a mistake like that again. And if you're willing to accept it, I want to apologize to you directly in person. If not, I understand either way. I just wanted you to know that I do see my mistake now, and I am truly sorry, Miss Elise. Zara Collins read the email twice, her lips pressing together as she considered the words. She didn't expect an apology, not a real one. She had seen people apologize before, not because they meant it, but because they had to. But this felt different. It wasn't defensive, it wasn't begging for forgiveness, it wasn't trying to shift blame, it was honest. And that surprised her. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the armrest, debating whether or not she even wanted to respond. She didn't need an apology, she had already won. The system was changing, the conversation was happening, and Miss Elise had already faced her consequences. But something in her gut told her that ignoring the email would be too easy. She glanced at her father, who had just ended his call and was now watching her with a raised eyebrow. "What's that look for?" he asked. Zara Collins tilted the phone toward him so he could read the message. His expression didn't change much as he scanned it, but when he finished, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and thought, "She didn't have to send that." "No," he finally said. Zara Collins agreed, and she didn't send it. He studied her. "What do you want to do?" Zara Collins sighed, considering her options. She could ignore it, walk away knowing that Ms. Elise would probably never make this mistake again. That would be easy. Or she could answer, not because Ms. Elise deserved it, but because growth was something worth acknowledging. She exhaled sharply, then quickly typed a response. Subject, My apology. Miss Elise, I appreciate your email. I'm not angry anymore, but I hope you understand that this isn't just about me. There are other people who have been in my situation, who never got justice, who never had a voice. I was lucky that my father could make things right, but not everyone has that privilege. You say you won't make this mistake again. I hope that's true, because I'm not interested in whether or not you're sorry. I'm interested in whether or not you change. I won't meet with you, but I do accept your apology. Not because you deserve it, but because I believe people can learn from their mistakes. Zara Collins. She hit send. Her father watched her closely as she put her phone down. That was a good response, he said with a shrug. I wasn't going to let her off easy, he smirked. That's my girl. A few minutes later, his assistant poked her head into the office. Mr. Miller, the board is ready for you, he said, standing and adjusting his suit. You sure you don't want to come in? Zara Collins shook her head. Nah, I've done my part, she chuckled. Yes, you have, he replied. As he left, Zara Collins sat back in her chair, feeling an unexpected sense of peace. She hadn't expected this situation to unfold the way it had. She hadn't expected to be at the center of something so much bigger than herself. But now, as she looked out the office window at the busy city below, she realized something. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about the way people were treated, the way assumptions shaped reality, the way power was used and misused. Miss Elise had misjudged her, had humiliated her, but in the end she was the one who had to live with the consequences, and Zara Collins would keep walking forward, head held high, knowing that she hadn't just been a victim in this story, she had been a force of change, and that was better than any apology. In this story, we learn a powerful lesson about not judging others by their appearance or by our own preconceived ideas. The flight attendant's disrespect not only hurt the passenger deeply, but also ended up ruining her own career. It clearly shows that when power is misused without fairness and respect, it leads to a breakdown in trust and sparks conflict. This incident reminds us to look inward, to reflect on our own actions, and to take responsibility for our mistakes. When we admit our faults and work to fix them, positive changes can occur that improve our workplace and our society. Patience, respect, and honest self-reflection are the keys to building a community where everyone is treated equally. Instead of shifting blame onto others, we should learn from our errors and make a genuine effort to change. Ultimately, the story teaches us that our actions have consequences, and that personal growth comes from owning up to our mistakes and using them as an opportunity to become better people. This lesson encourages us to strive for continuous self-improvement every day. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. Evelyn looked like any other teenage girl, quiet and respectful, holding a first-class ticket that should have promised her a taste of luxury, but instead it marked her for humiliation. She had the same gentle, unassuming presence as any other passenger, yet from the moment Claire, the lead flight attendant with icy blonde hair and a demeanor of absolute authority, laid eyes on her, everything changed. Claire's gaze was sharp and her judgment even sharper. She seemed to see in Evelyn not a young girl who had earned her place through hard work, but rather an imposter unworthy of the privileges of first class. And to make matters worse, there was an undercurrent of discrimination in the way she spoke, a dismissal tinted by a prejudice that suggested Evelyn's quiet confidence and her seemingly different background were enough to cast her aside. As Evelyn sat near the window with her light gray hoodie and simple jeans, clothes chosen for comfort, not for show, she clutched her boarding pass like a fragile token of her accomplishment. It was her first time flying without her family, a moment meant to be celebrated following her impressive straight-A results. But all that awaited her was the cruel sneer of a flight attendant who believed she did not belong in the privileged cabin. From the very first encounter, the tension was palpable. Claire's steps grew slower and more deliberate as she approached Evelyn's row, her eyes narrowing in a way that spoke of deep-seated resentment. "Hi there, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Claire asked, her tone polite on the surface but laced with an unmistakable edge. Evelyn, taken aback yet trying to remain composed, confirmed that she was indeed in seat 1A, as her father had so proudly booked it. But Claire's response was swift and merciless. Without a hint of empathy, she demanded, "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Even as Evelyn handed over the pass without protest, Claire's eyes flicked between the printed seat number and the young girl before her. There was a moment when it seemed as if the entire cabin held its breath. The other passengers watched in uncomfortable silence, unwilling to challenge the authority that had so brazenly undermined Evelyn. All around her, whispers of judgment and eyes filled with silent disapproval bore into Evelyn, creating a sense of isolation that was almost unbearable. Claire, who prided herself on upholding the strict rules of the airline, declared in a tone that brooked no argument that Evelyn needed to move to the back of the plane. "This seat is reserved for paying first-class passengers only," she insisted, her words punctuated by a cold finality that left no room for discussion. Evelyn's heart pounded as the humiliation set in. Not only had her rightful place been snatched away, but it was now accompanied by the sting of racial prejudice. as if her differences, whether in appearance or background, made her unworthy of care and respect. Every eye in the cabin seemed to turn away, offering no solace, no defense. Instead, they silently approved of the injustice being executed before them. In that charged moment, as Evelyn gathered her belongings and began to shuffle reluctantly towards the rear of the plane, a silent figure observed the unfolding scene with a presence that spoke volumes. Seated in the adjacent row, a man in a tailored navy suit, his expression calm yet enigmatic, had been watching everything with a composure that belied the intensity brewing beneath the surface. This man was not merely another passenger. He was Richard Matthews, the billionaire owner of the airline and, more importantly, Evelyn's father. His face remained impassive as he read the message on his phone. A brief, bitter note confirming that his daughter had been unjustly displaced. Every word of that message stoked the fire of anger and resolve within him, for he knew that this was not simply a matter of a seating error, but a deliberate act of cruelty fueled by bias and arrogance. Richard's reaction was measured but unmistakably fierce. His jaw tightened and his eyes darkened as he reviewed the text, each sentence a confirmation of the insult not only to his daughter, but also to the ideals he held dear. For Richard, this was not just an isolated incident. It represented the culmination of years of unchecked prejudice and the dismissive treatment of those deemed lesser by an outdated system. It pained him to see his daughter, a symbol of innocence and hope in his eyes, reduced to nothing more than a victim of a callous protocol. He had always believed in fairness and compassion, and the silent complicity of the other passengers only intensified his determination to set things right. Meanwhile, as Evelyn was forced into the cramped confines of economy class, her emotions churned internally. Each step away from the cabin she deserved was a reminder of the injustice and the searing sting of discrimination. Her small, trembling hands clutched the smartphone as she hastily typed out a short, desperate message. "She made me leave first class and she took the ticket from my hand," the message read, a confession of the betrayal that cut deeper than any physical pain. The weight of the injustice, amplified by the absence of support from fellow travelers who remained silent, overwhelmed her. It was a moment of vulnerability, a fragment of her innocence shattered by the unyielding cruelty of a system that treated her as an intruder based solely on an arbitrary perception of her worth. In the distance, hidden among the rows of disgruntled and disinterested passengers, Richard observed the unfolding scene with a resolve that grew with every passing second. He adjusted his cufflinks and, with a quiet determination, dialed Control HQ on his phone. His voice was calm but carried an undercurrent of authority that demanded immediate action. Within moments, his call had triggered a chain reaction that rippled through the cabin, a reminder that the wrong had been done. As the cabin crew went about their tasks, blissfully unaware of the storm about to be unleashed, Richard's silent fury began to shape the course of the events. The man who had just been humiliated was not alone. His presence and influence would soon make it clear that there would be no toleration of such blatant disrespect. The tension escalated even further when the captain of the flight, a seasoned professional with over 20 years of service, was alerted to the situation. A senior operations officer appeared on the in-flight monitor, his voice calm but firm as he explained the incident in precise detail. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the report. A first-class passenger had been forcibly removed and relegated to economy, and that passenger was the daughter of Richard Matthews, a man whose reputation within the airline industry was both formidable and feared. The implications were clear. If Richard Matthews was on board, then the matter would not be allowed to fade quietly into the background. The captain, sensing the gravity of the moment, complied with the officer's instructions without hesitation. Every person present, from the flight attendants to the passengers, understood that this was not just about a seating mistake. It was about restoring dignity and confronting systemic discrimination head-on. As the procedure to locate Claire and force her immediate recall began, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere of the entire plane. The rigid composure of those who had silently witnessed the injustice started to crumble under the weight of shared guilt and mounting anticipation of retribution. Richard Matthews, who until then had been the epitome of controlled authority, now radiated a quiet menace that promised not only accountability, but a dramatic, earth-shattering response. It was as if the air itself crackled with the energy of impending justice. A justice that would be served not with the careful measures of corporate protocol, but with an explosive, transformative act of vengeance that would leave no doubt about the consequences of mistreating someone of true merit. In that moment, as the passengers watched in stunned silence, Richard Matthews orchestrated his next moves with military precision. He instructed his trusted aides at Control HQ to pull every lever at their disposal. Every department, from customer relations to operations, was mobilized to ensure that the flight attendant responsible for this disgraceful act would be held accountable, not just publicly, but in a manner so resounding that no one on board would ever forget the power of righteous retribution. Richard's message was clear. No act of cruelty, no matter how trivial it might appear to an indifferent onlooker, would go unanswered when it was directed against his daughter, a young woman who, despite the ridicule she had suffered, represented hope, resilience, and the promise of a brighter, more equitable future. The unfolding drama, charged with the fire of personal loss and systemic injustice, resonated deeply with every passenger. The silence that had enveloped the cabin moments before was replaced by an undercurrent of murmured apprehension and disbelief. The stark disparity between the indifference of the many and the determined wrath of one was a living illustration of the worst injustices in society, a society where prejudice, in its many forms, had the power to disenfranchise even the most deserving. And as the flight hurtled toward its destination, the storm that Richard Matthews had set in motion promised to shake not only the foundations of the airline, but also the very soul of a system that had long failed to protect the vulnerable. Evelyn, now seated in the economy class with a lingering sense of isolation and sorrow, became the embodiment of injustice and the spark that ignited a formidable fight against entrenched discrimination. Her quiet dignity, marred by cruelty yet unbroken, was about to transform into a symbol of retribution. Her father's measured fury and the collective silence of those who had witnessed the offense would soon culminate in a cascade of events so grand and unexpected that it would leave everyone, passengers, crew, and even distant regulators, in awe. It was a moment when despair could have easily overwhelmed her, but instead it laid the groundwork for a retaliatory masterstroke that promised not merely to redress the wrong but to shatter the chains of indifference and prejudice once and for all. In the ensuing minutes, as every crew member and passenger braced for what was to come, the story of Evelyn Matthews would be rewritten into an epic tale of courage, vengeance, and the inexorable triumph of justice. A tale that would remind every 65-year-old woman listening that even in the darkest moments, there is a spark of hope, ready to kindle the flames of change. Evelyn had just experienced the kind of indignity that one never forgets, especially when the injustice unfolds right before your eyes on a transcontinental flight. Picture this: as the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the first-class cabin, one of the flight attendants stirred sugar into her cup with a small, self-satisfied smirk on her lips. That attendant, Claire Henson, had not given a second thought to the moment she sent Evelyn, an innocent young woman with every right to be seated in first class, to the cramped quarters of economy. In Claire's mind, she believed she was doing the airline a favor by upholding a rigid standard of who belonged in first class. To her, maintaining order was paramount, and any deviation from that order was intolerable. What she failed to notice, however, was the weight of her cruelty and the ripple effect it had on every soul aboard, as even the other flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances and shifted their eyes away when she walked by. When the overhead intercom buzzed with a crisp announcement, "Ms. Claire Henson, please report to the cockpit immediately," a chill seemed to run through the cabin. The sound of that call was as sharp as the clink of the spoon against the ceramic mug Claire held. For a moment, she froze on the spot, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. In a swift, almost imperceptible change, her fellow crew members feigned busyness as though nothing unusual had occurred. With no time to dwell on the implications, Claire set her coffee down, straightened her immaculate uniform, and marched stiffly toward the front of the plane. Every step she took down the polished aisle was laden with the tension of an impending reckoning, and unbeknownst to her, a steely-eyed Richard seated in 1B tracked her every move, his expression unreadable, yet undeniably colder than any chill ever felt on those high-flying miles above the ground. Once inside the cockpit, Captain Reynolds motioned for Claire to take a seat beside him. The man from headquarters, whose penetrating gaze seemed to unnerve even the most seasoned crew, wasted no time in laying out the day's glaring error. He said, plainly and without a hint of emotion, that a first-class passenger had been removed from her seat. Evelyn Matthews, as the report had it. There was a moment of palpable silence as Claire's confidence began to falter. She tried to muster a forced smile and explained that there was a young girl in seat 2A who had apparently been in the wrong section, insisting that it was nothing more than a routine correction. But when pressed to verify the details by checking her ticket, she admitted in a stammer that she had only glanced at it, and admitted that she did not recognize the name on it. There was a sting in the way she said it. A sting that cut deep because it exposed the shallow bias behind her hasty judgment. As the conversation in the cockpit intensified, it became glaringly clear that the error was not just one of seating mismanagement. With an almost imperceptible shift in tone, the officer leaned forward and challenged Claire by asking if she had based her decision solely on how the young passenger looked. That question struck at the heart of the matter, revealing that it wasn't merely a simple mistake, but a prejudiced act. Claire hesitated, her voice quivering as she admitted that it had been a judgment call, a decision swayed by her own narrow perceptions of who belonged in first class. The revelation was like a thunderbolt in the quiet of the cockpit. In that charged atmosphere, the officer laid out the incontrovertible fact. Evelyn Matthews was not just any passenger. She was the daughter of Richard Matthews, the billionaire owner of the airline and a man whose reputation was built on integrity and uncompromising strength. To have humiliated his daughter so publicly was unacceptable by any standard, and the orders from Mr. Matthews were as clear as they were merciless. Claire's face paled as the severity of her actions dawned on her. She tried to argue that she had merely corrected a mistake, but the officer's cold, unyielding words left her with no valid defense. Captain Reynolds, his expression somber and his tone measured, issued the orders that would seal Claire's fate. She was to return to Evelyn in first class, apologize in front of every single passenger, and personally escort her back to the comfort she had been unjustly denied. Moreover, upon landing, Claire was to report to the executive board for a formal review, a disciplinary move that would signal to everyone on board that no act of discrimination, no matter how subtle, would be allowed to go unchallenged. The fallout from that conversation was immediate and palpable. Claire emerged from the cockpit, her hands trembling ever so slightly, betraying the loss of composure she had so meticulously maintained over countless flights. Her once pristine demeanor had fractured, and every step she took back into the first-class cabin was fraught with the heaviness of impending accountability. As she re-entered the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The passengers who had earlier exchanged polite smiles now looked away, or observed her with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Even the crew members, who had earlier been complicit in her authority, now stared at her with expressions that conveyed their shared unease. And there, in his seat in 1B, Richard sat motionless, his piercing gaze a silent testament to the magnitude of the injustice that had been done. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit economy section, Evelyn sat quietly in her small seat, the earbuds in her ears doing little to drown out the cacophony of hurt and indignity that swirled within her. Her face remained calm in appearance, yet her body betrayed a stiffness that spoke of inner turmoil. She had not allowed herself to shed a single tear. Not then, not now. but every polite word from Claire and every judgmental glance from strangers had cut into her like a series of small, relentless jabs. The cruelty of the situation was compounded by the isolation she felt, a stark contrast to the warmth and respect that should have accompanied such a monumental achievement as her first flight, alone, a milestone meant to celebrate her academic success and her father's affection. Then came the moment when Claire, now visibly shaken, approached the row where Evelyn sat. In a tone that was both hushed and uncertain, Claire said, "Miss Matthews, it seems there has been a misunderstanding." She lowered herself slightly, as if trying to bridge the gap between her previous arrogance and the necessity of contrition. Evelyn, who had been quietly enduring the weight of her isolation, pulled out one earbud and fixed her eyes on Claire. There was a long, expectant silence before Claire attempted to salvage the situation with a weak apology, claiming that it was all a misunderstanding, a mere error in seating assignment. Yet Evelyn's voice, soft but resolute, cut through the murmur of the nearby passengers as she queried, "You saw my ticket and yet told me to move. Why did you think I did not belong in first class?" Her words, both piercing and dignified, resonated with every soul listening in the cabin. For a moment, time seemed to slow down as the implications of her question sank into every heart present. The moral outrage in the cabin was nearly tangible. Passengers who had earlier remained silent now exchanged glances and whispered amongst themselves. The aura of passive acceptance had been shattered by Evelyn's inquiry, exposing the thin line between procedural errors and overt prejudice. At that point, Claire's attempt at a gentle recovery faltered completely. Her face, already paling from the severity of the repercussions, lost whatever pretense of authority she still held. She confessed with a trembling voice that she had indeed made a judgment call without verifying the ticket thoroughly. A confession that, while truthful, did nothing to mitigate the harm done. As the confrontation unfolded, Evelyn did not recoil into further silence. Instead, with measured calmness that belied the storm raging inside her, she sent a brief message to her father. The message was a quiet inquiry laced with the determination to seek accountability, asking him how Claire should be made to understand the gravity of her error. Richard's response was swift and unsparing. He instructed, with the precision of a man used to directing vast corporate operations, that this was far from a mere mistake. It was an affront to respect, dignity, and the very values that his airline supposedly stood for. The message was clear. It was high time that those who would use their authority to belittle and dismiss others, especially on the basis of appearance or background, faced a reckoning that would resonate loudly far beyond the confines of that one flight. With that, Evelyn looked directly into Claire's eyes and calmly stated that she would return to first class, but only after receiving a sincere explanation for the unfounded assumption that she was unworthy of her rightful place. The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand, and every passenger seemed to hang on those few words. At that moment, it was as if the entire cabin bore witness to the ultimate test of integrity and decency. Each pair of eyes reflected a shared sentiment of sympathetic outrage, and even those who once turned a blind eye now seemed unwilling to ignore the injustice that had been so brazenly displayed. For Claire, the weight of her mistake became all too real. No longer could she rely on the shield of routine or the comfort of indifference. Instead, she was forced to confront not only the expectations of her employer, but the silent, unyielding judgment of every person on that plane. And as Richard's steely presence from 1B continued to loom large, it was evident that whatever lay ahead would be a transformative moment. One where the scales of justice would tip and the cruelty of unchecked bias would finally be met with the resounding echo of accountability. In that charged space between the economy and first class, amidst whispers and stifled gasps, a new chapter was being written. A chapter defined by the unwavering determination of a young woman who refused to be diminished, and by a system that was about to be forced to reckon with its own failures in protecting the dignity of every individual. Evelyn Matthews sat silently in her economy seat, her eyes fixed out the window at a sky brushed with dusk. The hum of the engines, usually a lullaby for weary travelers, now felt like a taunting reminder of her unjust displacement. Moments earlier, she had endured a savage humiliation when a flight attendant, Claire Henson, had brazenly ordered her to leave her rightful first-class seat. Now, as the tension in the cabin reached a fever pitch, Claire finally stopped beside her row. Evelyn sensed the presence before hearing the uncertain voice. "Miss Matthews," Claire began softly, crouching slightly as if trying to bridge an impossible gap of authority and remorse. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Her voice was thinner now, as though even her words trembled with the weight of what she had done. Evelyn pulled out one earbud slowly and turned her gaze toward Claire, whose tight smile did little to disguise the nervousness in her eyes. "I would like to escort you back to your original seat," Claire announced, her tone forced and brittle. Evelyn regarded her for a long moment, unmoving and silent, as if each second was loaded with judgment. The silence in that cramped space grew heavier than any airplane engine's roar. Finally, Claire rushed out an apology. "I apologize if there has been any inconvenience." But Evelyn's expression remained unchanged, stern and composed as she challenged, "You're calling it a misunderstanding?" The accusation was soft, but every syllable cut deeper than the harshest shout ever could. A low murmur rose from a few rows ahead where passengers who had witnessed the earlier debacle listened intently. The air was thick with unspoken questions and collective disapproval. Claire's face reddened and her palms began to sweat, physical evidence of the unraveling control she'd once wielded so effortlessly. "I may have made a mistake in judgment," Claire admitted haltingly, her voice barely above a whisper, but Evelyn, with a calm authority that belied the pain roiling inside her, tilted her head and retorted, "That is not the same as a misunderstanding." Her words were quiet, yet inexorably firm, echoing in the silence that all around seemed to share in her unyielding demand for accountability. Evelyn reached for her phone with measured grace and typed a short message. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The message read like a quiet ultimatum. "Claire, why did you say I did not belong when you saw my ticket?" The cabin fell into a suspended silence as even the air seemed to grow denser with tension. Nearby, Claire's eyes dropped to the floor, her face a storm of regret and panic. "You didn't ask anyone in first class for their ticket," Evelyn continued, her voice steady. "You only questioned me." The statement reverberated across the aisle. Passengers, previously absorbed in their own worlds, now exchanged glances filled with both discomfort and a burgeoning sense of solidarity. It was as though the whole cabin had suddenly become complicit in condemning the cruelty that had been so casually inflicted. Minutes later, a brief message from her father, Richard Matthews, flashed on Evelyn's phone. The reply was terse and authoritative. "Richard, take your time. Make her understand what she did." It was a clear message that the scales of justice were about to tip, and that no one, even someone as obstinate and self-important as Claire Henson, could escape the consequences of her discrimination. Evelyn placed her phone back in her bag and looked directly into Claire's eyes with a mix of quiet resolve and raw hurt. "I will go back," Evelyn said with a calm determination that resonated across the cabin. "But I want to know why you believed I did not belong." For a long moment the silence was absolute. The oppressive quiet was punctuated only by the steady beat of the airplane's engines and the soft rustle of passengers shifting uneasily in their seats. Claire's face crumpled under the relentless pressure. "You didn't ask anyone else," Evelyn pressed, her voice a gentle yet insistent demand for the truth. "It was just me." "Why?" The question was not shouted. It was spoken with the measured cadence of someone who had suffered greatly and was no longer willing to accept excuses. Around them, a small crowd of passengers leaned in as if privy to a secret trial, their eyes filled with empathy for the young woman and a shared indignation at the injustice being laid bare. In the background, a younger attendant named Emma watched quietly from the corner. Emma's eyes, usually so full of deference to protocol, now shone with quiet judgment. She had been trained to manage unruly passengers and maintain the illusion of order, but witnessing Claire's collapse under the weight of her error had exposed a reality that even Emma could not ignore. "You should probably sit down before you collapse," Emma finally muttered, her tone laced with a mix of concern and admonishment. Claire turned sharply, her voice tight with the embarrassment of 1,000 stares. "I don't need your comments." Emma simply lifted her hands, her expression unreadable, replying, "Just saying, you're really sweating this." The exchange underscored the stark contrast between the indifferent cruelty of those in charge and the dignified composure of the wronged. For Claire, every second on that flight was transforming into an unrelenting reminder of her failure. The smug satisfaction she once felt in enforcing a rigid notion of who belonged in first class had morphed into bitter regret. The reality of what she had done, publicly shaming a young woman of exceptional promise simply because she did not fit a preconceived notion, was inescapable. She recalled the moment she had ordered Evelyn to move, the curt dismissal in her own voice, and the unmistakable look of hurt in Evelyn's eyes. Now, standing there with trembling hands, Claire understood that her authority was crumbling. Once, her badge had been a symbol of control and expertise, but now it felt like a heavy burden, each gilded letter a reminder of her transgression. Around them, the passengers continued to watch, their expressions shifting between sympathy for Evelyn and silent disapproval of Claire's behavior. One gentleman, his voice hesitant, attempted to offer a comment. I saw what happened earlier," he stammered. "That was unfortunate." Evelyn's eyes met his for a moment, and she replied quietly, "A mistake?" She explained calmly that Claire had seen her ticket, knew exactly who she was, and still chose to act with baseless prejudice. "You assumed I didn't belong without verifying," Evelyn said, her tone laced with sorrow and quiet fury. "And if I weren't someone important, would it have been okay then?" The question hung in the air, an indictment of a system that valued appearance over substance and bias over fairness. Meanwhile, back in the galley, Claire stood rigidly by a counter, trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped entirely from her grasp. The polished floor and the orderly array of drinks offered little solace as her mind raced through every misstep. Every glance from Richard Matthews, whose eyes burned with a quiet but unyielding intensity, reminded her that no one was immune to accountability. Her attempts to focus on arranging the drinks cart were futile. Even the act of wiping her trembling palms with a napkin brought no relief. She knew that her mistake had not only embarrassed her, but had also shaken the very foundation of her authority. Every whispered conversation, every furtive glance from crew members, confirmed that her reputation was now in tatters. Then, as if fate itself had decided to heighten the drama, the in-flight phone on the wall buzzed with an urgent call. Claire's hands shook uncontrollably as she answered, her voice stiff and formal. "This is Claire." A deep, controlled voice from the other end responded unmistakably, "This is Richard Matthews." In that brief, charged exchange, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Richard's words were both a threat and a promise. He had already spoken with operations, and there would be a formal review. "You will be expected to explain every part of your conduct on this flight," Richard declared, his tone leaving no room for ambiguity. Every decision, every word, every expression. The magnitude of his words crashed over Claire like a tidal wave, stripping away any lingering hope of escaping unscathed. The finality in his voice marked the point of no return. Claire's throat tightened, and for a moment she could only offer a choked whisper in reply. That whisper, laden with shame and regret, was the sound of someone who had recognized too late that her actions were not only a personal failing, but a breach of the very principles that should define decency in service and respect for every individual. The atmosphere in the cabin was electric with the promise of retribution. A retribution that would not merely be an internal corporate review, but a public reckoning against a system steeped in outdated biases and cruelty. In that moment, Evelyn sat back in her seat with a renewed sense of dignity, as her father's earlier message reaffirmed that she belonged where she was meant to be. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her expression a quiet blend of relief and determination. The once oppressive silence now resonated with a newfound clarity. Justice was on its way. In that long, poignant pause before the final review, it became clear that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The superficial markers of class and privilege that once dictated who was worthy had been exposed as fragile constructs, easily shattered by the courage of one determined soul. And as the plane continued its journey over vast American skies, every passenger, especially those like the compassionate 65-year-old women listening to this unfolding drama, could sense that something monumental was happening. A reckoning was underway, one that promised to redefine the boundaries of respect and dignity in a society that too often tolerated prejudice. In that charged air, both Evelyn and the silent figures around her were united in the hope that out of this humiliation, a brighter, more equitable future would be forged. Evelyn Matthews sat in her economy seat with an air of quiet dignity, though every fiber of her being still trembled from the events that had unfolded earlier. As the flight neared its final moments, the weight of what had happened pressed down on the cabin like a heavy Texas summer heat. Claire Henson, the flight attendant whose callous decision had set this whole tragedy in motion, was now face to face with the unyielding authority of Richard Matthews. Through a terse phone call, Richard had made it unequivocally clear, "Mr. Matthews, I'm not interested in excuses. This isn't about me, it's about my daughter. You made her feel like she didn't belong. You treated her like a problem, and you did it in front of strangers who chose to stay silent." His words burned into every corner of the cockpit and cabin, leaving Claire standing there, her skin flushing with a shame that spread like wildfire. All her years of maintaining order in the skies, years of enforcing protocol without a second thought, seemed to vanish in the face of this uncompromising rebuke. Claire's weak "yes, sir," as she ended the call did little to mask the tremor in her hands and the unsteady feeling in her knees. Here she was, a veteran accustomed to the controlled chaos of mid-air emergencies, now crumbling under the invisible weight of her own prejudiced misjudgment. Gripping the polished counter for support, she turned toward Emma, the younger attendant, whose eyes now held a blend of sympathy and quiet reproach. Emma's raised eyebrow said it all, and when she asked in a hushed tone if that was indeed Richard Matthews speaking, Claire could only nod, her response a murmur. He didn't scream. He didn't have to. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in first class with the poise of someone who had weathered an unimaginable storm. She had returned to her plush seat, clutching a well-worn paperback and sipping a glass of sparkling water, a small, defiant symbol of her right to belong where she was meant to. Yet even as she feigned attention to the words on the page, her thoughts raced back to every piercing moment. The cold dismissal in the aisle, the forced and feeble apology from Claire, and the overwhelming hurt of being singled out as if she were a misfit. It was not just the physical act of being moved from her rightful seat. It was the degrading implication that, by simply being herself, she did not measure up to the standard of first-class passenger. And in that degrading act, the true measure of cruelty was revealed, one that was steeped in a prejudice that burned through the veneer of professionalism. Evelyn's phone buzzed softly, and a curt message from her father confirmed his steadfast resolve. "Richard, she won't speak to you again unless necessary. I made that clear." Evelyn's smile was faint, resolute, and a tacit promise that she would not allow such an injustice to define her worth. Her fingers steadied as she placed the phone back in her bag. Across the aisle, an older gentleman with decades of first-class experience leaned in, his voice cautious as he spoke softly to her. "I just want to say what happened earlier wasn't right. You handled it with remarkable patience." Evelyn regarded him with quiet gratitude and replied, "That's the thing. If I had screamed or shouted, they'd call me angry or emotional. But if I stay calm, they say I'm impressive." Her words, measured and laden with pain, cut through the stale air of the cabin like a gentle but unwavering force demanding accountability. Back in the galley, Claire Henson's world was crumbling. Her once solid hold on authority was now nothing more than a fragile veneer. Her colleagues' hushed conversations and the piercing, disappointed stares of passengers were constant reminders of the wrong she had committed. Each passing second was filled with the grim realization that her decision, one made in an instant based on nothing more than a hasty judgment about a teenage girl, had irrevocably tarnished her career. She clutched a crumpled napkin, trying in vain to wipe away the sweat that betrayed her inner panic. Every touch of the cool, hard surface of the counter only deepened the sense of impending doom that loomed as the plane descended, inch by agonizing inch, toward the airport. Captain Reynolds and his co-pilot maintained a steady stream of communication with ground control, each update making it clear that the landing was not merely the end of a routine flight, but the prologue to a corporate reckoning. "Someone's going to answer for this," the co-pilot murmured with a heavy tone of inevitability. "And I'm guessing she has no idea how bad it's going to get." With every foot the plane lost in altitude, the tension in the cabin grew thicker. When the seatbelt sign blinked on, and Captain Reynolds' calm, practiced voice reminded everyone to secure their belongings, Claire stood frozen in the galley, caught between a desperate desire to escape and the paralyzing fear of what awaited her at the gate. As the aircraft neared the runway, passengers began to stir from their seats. Some resumed gathering their belongings as if nothing had happened, while others kept glancing toward the aisle with eyes full of apprehension. Then, a uniformed security officer stepped through the front door with deliberate authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding a quiet yet unassailable command, his entrance shifted the already electric atmosphere in the cabin. All conversation halted. Every eye turned to him as he scanned the room and said, clearly and firmly, "Claire Henson." The officer's tone brooked no defiance. Almost ceremoniously, the curtain in the galley pulled aside, and Claire emerged, her steps hesitant, each one an echo of her rapid descent from power. Inside the cabin, every passenger now felt as if they were witnessing more than just the end of a flight. They were witnessing the unraveling of a system founded on outdated ideas of class and prejudice. Evelyn's gaze, unwavering and determined, never wavered. It was as if her silence had become a banner of resistance, a quiet testament that no one would ever again reduce her worth to a mere stereotype or a mistaken identity. Her father's nod from his seat was an unspoken seal of approval, a silent confirmation that Evelyn belonged in first class, not because of wealth or entitlement, but because of her inherent dignity and the truth of her achievements. The final moments before landing played out like a dramatic interlude on a Broadway stage. The captain's announcement, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off," was delivered in that familiar, reassuring tone. But for those who had witnessed the high drama, it was the quiet aftermath that resonated the loudest. Claire's fate, now sealed by the preceding calls and the stern look of the security officer, was a public reminder that no one was above accountability. Her collapsing authority, once embodied in a crisp uniform and an unyielding demeanor, now lay in tatters beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the cabin. In that charged atmosphere, as passengers gathered and exchanged furtive glances, Evelyn remained a pillar of calm amid the storm. Her eyes, soft yet blazing with resolve, spoke of the strength that comes from enduring injustice and emerging unbowed. Though she had felt the sting of prejudice and the chill of public humiliation, she now radiated an air of impervious determination. Every passenger in that cabin, especially those wise and empathetic souls who had witnessed it all, could not help but feel that her quiet, steadfast refusal to be diminished was a call to arms against a system that had long tolerated cruelty. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the security officer's steady gaze never left Claire, who was now escorted silently toward her inevitable confrontation with corporate accountability. In contrast, Evelyn leaned back in her seat, her posture a defiant assertion of her right to be there, a right that could never be questioned again. In that final, lingering moment before the doors opened and the passengers disembarked, the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. No longer was the measure of a person dictated by superficial appearances or outdated protocols. It was determined by the quiet conviction and strength of character that Evelyn had displayed throughout this ordeal. When the plane finally came to a stop and the cabin lights brightened, there was an unspoken understanding among all present. Justice was not simply a matter of policy, but a deeply personal crusade against the insidious forces of bias and indifference. For Evelyn Matthews, the pain of humiliation was now transformed into a powerful symbol of resistance, a symbol that would echo far beyond the confines of this single flight. And as she gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark, every step she took was a silent proclamation that her dignity, her hard-won achievements, and her unassailable right to belong in every space would forever stand as a beacon of hope for those who had ever been made to feel less than they truly were. Evelyn Matthews sat with quiet dignity in her first-class seat, though the memory of the events earlier still clung to her like a shadow. The flight had taken an unexpected turn when Claire Henson, whose discriminatory actions had upended everything, now faced the full force of accountability. Moments earlier, in the midst of a hushed yet thunderous reaction from passengers, a security officer had approached Claire with a crisp, unyielding command. His tone was as cold and measured as a winter dawn in Wichita, and as he spoke, the once confident flight attendant stood pale and composed, but visibly trembling. "Yes," she replied softly when addressed, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the mounting realization that her actions were about to be scrutinized in full public view. "You'll need to come with us," the officer announced clearly. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged glances that mixed shock with a quiet, almost satisfied sense of justice. Others stared straight ahead in wide-eyed disbelief. Claire tried to maintain a neutral expression as she was forced to answer, "Is there a problem?" But the officer's icy reply left no room for negotiation. "There have been reports of a discriminatory incident involving the removal of a first-class passenger. Mr. Matthews has requested a formal review. You will be escorted for questioning." With her head bowed, Claire nodded slowly. Her legs felt stiff as if weighted by the gravity of her actions, and her arms drooped in resignation as she turned to walk down the aisle, the very aisle that Evelyn had traversed earlier, unperturbed and dignified. Each step that Claire took now, accompanied by the steady presence of the security officer trailing behind her, echoed like a countdown to inevitable retribution. Every row she passed felt like a courtroom gallery, with every passenger silently casting judgment. There was no pity in their eyes, only a stern witness to the consequences of cruelty. Claire's usually assured stride had become a mirror of her own mistake. Each tap of her shoes on the carpeted aisle a reminder that authority built on prejudice could crumble in an instant. As she neared Evelyn's seat, she dared to steal a sideways glance. Evelyn, whose composure had been unbroken by the events, simply watched, calm, still, unmoved. And that unyielding poise struck Claire harder than any angry word or scornful smirk. It was as if Evelyn's serene silence said more than any rebuke could. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier with every step. Claire's face was a canvas of regret and fear as she walked further down the aisle, the security officer's presence intensifying the feeling of being under public trial. Every passenger's gaze felt like a spotlight, reflecting back at her the shame of her actions. Some looked on with a subtle sense of satisfaction, others with unmistakable discomfort, and a few with the quiet resolve that justice had finally begun its work. For Claire, this was no longer just another day on the job. It was a moment that would redefine everything she believed about herself. The steps that had once carried purpose and command now felt hollow, each one weighted with the bitter truth of the consequences she now faced. After what felt like an eternity under the silent, unblinking eyes of the passengers, Claire finally stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge. The cool air outside was sharper than she remembered, like a brisk November morning in downtown Chicago, and it seemed to amplify the chill of regret that coursed through her veins. At the end of the corridor, two airline executives in tailored suits waited with expressions as flat as polished glass. One of them was Daniel Crow, director of flight operations, a man whose gaze held the measured authority of decades in the aviation industry. The other executive, whose name Claire did not know, stood by silently. They did not smile, nod, or even offer the slightest hint of comfort. They simply turned and motioned for her to follow. Without the luxury of asking questions or seeking reassurance, Claire trailed after them into a restricted hallway tucked away behind the gate, an area strictly off-limits to passengers. The corridor led her past administrative offices, dimly lit interview rooms, and other spaces reserved for crew evaluations. The walls were painted a sterile pale gray, the lighting uncomfortably bright, and the air heavy with anticipation. At the end of the hall, she entered a small, sparsely furnished room with a long table, 3 chairs, and a closed door. Here, under the unyielding scrutiny of the corporate hierarchy, her fate would be decided. Daniel Crow remained standing near the door as the other man, identified by his name tag as James Walton, Executive Compliance Manager, took a seat across from Claire. A leather folder rested in front of him, a dossier of evidence that chronicled every detail of the incident. The flight captain's report, statements from no fewer than 4 passengers, and a formal complaint from Mr. Richard Matthews himself. James Walton's eyes locked onto Claire's, his tone calm but unrelenting as he asked, "You know why you're here?" Claire managed a small nod, her voice dry and devoid of defiance as she murmured, "Yes." Walton tapped the folder lightly with 2 fingers before continuing. "This file clearly documents that you treated a first-class passenger like she didn't belong. Without verifying her ticket, without asking politely, you made an assumption solely based on how she looked and acted on that baseless judgment in public." The words hit Claire like a series of blows, each one stripping away her veneer of authority and revealing the deep fault lines of prejudice beneath. When James Walton asked, "Was anyone else in first class asked to show a ticket?" Claire hesitated before whispering, "Just her." Walton exhaled slowly, his disappointment palpable. "Claire, do you understand the position this puts the airline in? This wasn't merely a minor seating error. You publicly humiliated the daughter of the company's CEO in front of a full cabin of passengers while her father, Mr. Matthews, sat just 10 feet away. This is not only a personal failing, it is a corporate liability." In that moment, a well of tears threatened to spill from Claire's eyes, yet she blinked them away, the sting of shame too overwhelming to fully express. I made a mistake," she stammered, the admission sounding hollow even to her own ears. "No, Claire," Walton said quietly but firmly. "You made a choice that was not only wrong, but dangerous. As a representative of this airline, you created a public relations disaster that is already trending on major platforms. Passengers were filming and a video was posted before the flight even landed." The weight of his words pressed down on Claire like a crushing force. "We are suspending you without pay, effective immediately. You will receive notification of a disciplinary hearing within the next 72 hours, and until then you are prohibited from entering any airline facilities or contacting current employees." His tone brooked no argument, and as the folder closed with a soft snap, Claire felt her world collapse under the burden of her own choices. Her legs felt numb and her throat burned with regret as she remembered the long flight. How, for over 10 years, she had prided herself on her professionalism and efficiency. She had handled in-air emergencies, trained junior staff, and maintained a record without a single major complaint. Now, with her badge stripped and her reputation in tatters, she was being forced out in disgrace. Walking out of the room, the cold fluorescent light of the terminal followed her like an unforgiving spotlight, and with each step along the sterile corridor, she felt the finality of that closed door echoing in her soul. Later, in the quiet solitude of an executive lounge on the other side of the terminal, Evelyn sat calmly across from her father, Richard Matthews. The lounge was a bastion of warmth and refined comfort, a stark contrast to the chaos of the flight's aftermath. Soft lighting, luxurious leather chairs, and polished wood accents provided a peaceful respite from the storm of events. Evelyn's posture was relaxed, almost defiant, as she sipped a warm drink and reflected on the cruelty she had endured. Her father leaned forward, his eyes full of concern and quiet pride, and gently asked, "You okay?" Evelyn simply nodded, her voice soft but resolute. "Yeah." When he inquired if she had been bothered after returning to her seat, she replied coolly, "No, I think they were scared too." Richard's short laugh, though unforced, conveyed both relief and a sober acknowledgement of the gravity of what had happened. The executives had taken swift action. Richard confirmed that Claire was being suspended, at least for now, as a clear message that discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. "We are giving her a chance to explain, but if she fails to own up to her actions and truly understand the gravity of her mistake, she won't work for us again," he said quietly. Evelyn's eyes, though unreadable, shone with a calm determination. "People like her never own up to their mistakes," she replied softly, a statement laden with both sorrow and the steely resolve of someone who has suffered but not been broken. Hours later, in the quiet solitude of her modest apartment, far from the glittering terminals and crowded cabins, Claire sat on the edge of her bed in the very uniform that now felt like a costume, tight at the collar and rough at the seams. The apartment was silence incarnate, with only the low hum of the fluorescent lights in the corridor outside to remind her that her world had irrevocably changed. Her airline-issued tablet lay dark and unresponsive on the nightstand, locked out of the crew system the moment her suspension was activated. A single buzz from her phone was enough to remind her of the isolation that now defined her. The supportive words of past colleagues were replaced by whispers and the cold distance of those who once admired her. As Claire sat there, every moment of the flight replayed in her mind in excruciating detail. Ava's calm yet piercing gaze, Richard's unwavering authority, Emma's sympathetic silence, and the stinging judgments of passengers who had witnessed her downfall. She had lived by the handbook, followed every protocol to the letter, and built her career on a foundation that now felt cracked and exposed. An email from the airline executive board lay open on her screen with the stark subject line, "Suspension Notification." It was a final, crushing blow, a statement that her professional life had come to an abrupt halt due to one fatal, discriminatory choice. In that stark moment of truth, as the cold reality of her suspension set in, Claire could do nothing but confront the emptiness of her own justification. The gravity of her actions, the public humiliation inflicted upon a young, promising passenger, and the irreversible damage to the airline's reputation were now hers to bear. And while the world outside continued on with its indifferent hustle, the echo of her mistake resonated in the quiet solitude of her once prized identity. A fading reminder that true power lies not in ruthless enforcement of outdated protocols, but in the measured, compassionate acknowledgement of every human being's right to belong. Evelyn Matthews sat in first class with quiet dignity, even as the memory of the humiliating ordeal earlier still cut deep. The incident had unfolded on Flight 748 like a bad dream, one that exposed not only overt discrimination but the insidious cruelty of unchecked authority. The moment when Claire Hinson, a once respected senior crew lead, coldly instructed her to move to economy, was seared into the minds of all on board. Now, as the plane finally descended, the repercussions of that fateful decision were manifesting with brutal clarity. The formal disciplinary process had been initiated by none other than Richard Matthews, Evelyn's own father and the CEO of the airline. In a terse phone call that had reverberated through the cabin earlier, Richard's voice had been devoid of anger, yet filled with steely resolve. "Mr. Matthews, I'm not interested in excuses. This isn't about me, it's about my daughter. You made her feel like she didn't belong. You treated her like a problem, and you did it right there in front of strangers who chose to stay silent. Those words had not only stung Claire, but had shattered the carefully constructed facade of professionalism she'd maintained for over a decade. After the call ended, Claire's hands shook uncontrollably as she slowly lowered her phone. Every footstep she took down the aisle, once an avenue for displaying her authority, now echoed like the gavel of a judge condemning her. The security officer's cold command had left no room for remorse. "You'll need to come with us." Gasps and knowing glances spread among the passengers as Claire trudged down that same aisle that Evelyn had once walked with pristine confidence. The oppressive weight of every judgmental gaze bore down on her. In that silent procession, each step Claire took felt like a retraction of the power she'd so arrogantly wielded. The security officer's presence behind her was like a metronome marking the final moments of her career. The aisle, which had served as a stage for countless flights, transformed into a courtroom where every silent witness, passengers and crew alike, observed the downfall of a woman who had once been the epitome of control. When she finally neared Evelyn's seat, Claire dared a sideways glance. Evelyn's face, calm and unmoved, held no trace of malicious glee. Rather, it conveyed a stern, almost implacable serenity that spoke louder than any rebuke. After disembarking, Claire was led through a sterile, brightly lit corridor by two airline executives. Daniel Crow, the director of flight operations, and James Walton, the executive compliance manager, awaited her in a narrow, unwelcoming room. The walls were painted a bland, pale gray, and the fluorescent lighting was unforgiving. A perfect metaphor for the harsh reality of her situation. Seated at a long table with a leather folder before him, James Walton fixed her with an unyielding gaze and asked, "You know why you're here?" Claire could only nod, her voice reduced to a dry whisper as she murmured, "Yes." Walton then methodically detailed the evidence. A report from the flight captain, statements from 4 passengers, and, most damningly, the formal complaint from Richard Matthews himself. Walton's words cut deeply. "This file clearly shows that you treated Evelyn like she didn't belong. You failed to verify her ticket, and worse, you made an assumption based solely on her appearance and acted on that bias publicly." His tone was devoid of overt malice, yet every syllable was loaded with the weight of accountability. When he pressed further, "Was anyone else in first class asked to show a ticket?" Claire's response was barely a whisper. "Just her." Walton exhaled slowly. "Do you understand the position this puts the airline in? You publicly humiliated the daughter of our CEO while he sat just 10 feet away. This isn't a minor seating error, it's a corporate crisis." Tears threatened to spill from Claire's eyes, but she blinked them away, the bitter sting of shame too overwhelming to fully express. As the conversation continued, Walton made it unambiguously clear that the repercussions were severe. "We are suspending you without pay, effective immediately. You will be notified of a disciplinary hearing within the next 72 hours, and you are prohibited from accessing airline systems or facilities until further notice." Those words, delivered in sterile, emotionless language, felt like a death sentence. Claire's spirit, once buoyed by years of polished professionalism, was shattered as she listened. The finality in Walton's tone reverberated like a gavel's final strike. Later that evening, back in the lonely confines of her apartment, Claire sat on the edge of her unmade bed. Her uniform, once a proud symbol of authority and excellence, now hung limply on a hook, as if it were a relic of a past life she no longer recognized. The airline-issued tablet lay dormant on her nightstand, a silent testament to her immediate disconnection from the crew system. She had received no comforting messages from colleagues. Instead, the whispers of those she once commanded now echoed through the digital void of her inbox. Then came an email from Richard Matthews himself, a message marked with the subject, "Accountability." With a mix of dread and a reluctant need for clarity, Claire tapped it open. "Miss Henson, I'm sure by now you understand the seriousness of what happened on Flight 748. I won't reiterate what the board has outlined, but accountability means giving people a chance to acknowledge their mistakes. I'm offering you that chance now. If you formally apologize to my daughter, I will ensure she receives your message. Understand, this apology is not for me or for the airline. It is for her. The message was sparse, its every sentence resonating like a challenge. There were no threats in Richard's words, only an opportunity and a demand that Claire finally face the mirror of her own actions. Claire set the phone down as if it had grown impossibly heavy. The message made it clear she was no longer part of the airline. The persona of Claire Henson, the senior crew leader to whom others once deferred, was gone. All that remained was a liability, a cautionary tale of arrogance and racism that had been laid bare for all to see. With trembling fingers, she went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and forced herself to drink, attempting at least to wash away the bitter taste of shame and regret. It was in these lonely hours that she finally recognized the truth she'd long denied. The rules and protocols she had once clung to were mere excuses that had blinded her to her own bias. Returning to her bedroom, Claire opened a new email draft with the subject, Re-accountability. With a deep, shuddering breath, she began to type a message meant for Richard Matthews, and by extension, for Evelyn. Mr. Matthews, I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not writing this to justify my actions. I write because I now understand how profoundly wrong I was. I misjudged Evelyn, and I acted on assumptions rather than facts. I let my own bias speak louder than truth, and for that I am deeply ashamed. I offer my sincere apology to Evelyn if she will accept it, though I understand if she chooses not to. Claire reread the message over and over, each word a painful admission of her failure. Finally, she pressed send, and in that moment, despite the loss of her badge and uniform, she felt an unfamiliar glimmer of humility, a small start toward redemption. Meanwhile, in the serene, refined ambience of the executive lounge at the terminal, Evelyn Matthews sat across from her father. The room exuded comfort, soft lighting, plush leather chairs, and polished wooden accents that belied the tumultuous storm that had shaken the skies moments before. Outside the wide glass windows, the city thrummed with life, cars moving smoothly along highways and sunlight glinting off modern skyscrapers. Yet inside, a profound silence reigned, a silence that spoke of storm aftermath and fragile hope. Richard leaned in, his voice measured and gentle as he asked, "You okay?" Evelyn's response was quiet but resolute, "Yeah." When asked if the ordeal had truly passed without further disturbance, she replied coolly, "They were scared too." Her calm defiance was in stark contrast with the chaos that had enveloped the flight, and her measured gaze, unyielding and proud, reflected both the pain of the experience and the strength it had forged in her. Richard confirmed that Claire Henson had been suspended, an unequivocal message that such discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. "We're giving her a chance to explain, but if she fails to truly acknowledge her mistake, she won't work for us again," he explained, his tone both pragmatic and firm. Evelyn's eyes, steady and clear, did not soften into forgiveness, but instead conveyed the raw lesson of the day. "I don't need an in-person apology from her," she said softly. "I'm not forgiving her for my sake. I'm doing it for my own. I don't want to shake her hand and pretend it's all okay, because it isn't." Her words, simple yet powerful, encapsulated not only her own experience but a broader truth, that people often endure judgment long before they are given the chance to speak, and that true change must come from within the hearts of those who wield power. In that quiet room, as Evelyn drafted her measured reply, one that acknowledged Claire's remorse while reaffirming the lessons of the painful experience, a change had begun. New policies were already being set in motion. Mandatory bias training, new reporting channels, and stricter oversight in first-class operations. Richard's determination to reform the system was as clear as the sharp lines of the modern office furnishings. "I'm changing the entire system," he said, his voice low with conviction, "not just because of one flight, but because of everyone who has ever been judged before they had a chance to speak. Evelyn's faint smile was one of both pride and determination. She had emerged from the crucible of discrimination not unscathed, but undeniably stronger, a beacon for those who have ever been silenced by prejudice. As the board's decision and her father's message rippled through the corridors of power, the fallout of that single flight became a catalyst for sweeping change in an airline system that had long turned a blind eye to subtle acts of racism. And though Claire Hinson now sat alone in her apartment the next morning, a space where her uniform hung limply and her broken pride was all that remained, Evelyn Matthews's quiet strength shone like a beacon of hope. In that transformative moment, despite the pain and humiliation inflicted upon her, Evelyn had reclaimed not only her rightful place in first class, but also her profound dignity. Evelyn Matthews sat in silence, the weight of that fateful flight and the ensuing fallout pressing down on her like a lead blanket on a chilly November evening. The suspension notice had been delivered in sterile, emotionless language, words that cut sharper than any angry outburst. And the cold truth was that she was no longer part of the airline. She had been reduced from a senior crew leader, the one others once looked up to nothing more than a liability waiting to be judged. The digital words screamed at her, a suspension without noise that echoed only in her own head. After sending her heartfelt apology message to Richard Matthews, hoping it might bring some sense of redemption or relief, the weight of her misdeed only sank deeper into her bones. When her phone buzzed with a new message, Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The subject line read, "My apology, from Ava Matthews." With trembling fingers and an anxious pause, she opened it, half expecting rejection or bitter silence. Instead, she found Ava's measured response. Ava wrote, "Claire, I read your message. I appreciate that you didn't try to defend yourself, because most people don't see what they've done until it touches their own lives. I don't need an in-person apology, not out of anger, but because I think you already know how it felt. This isn't just about you and me, it's about everyone who gets judged before they even speak. I was lucky because my father was there watching, but most people aren't, and that's why I accept your apology. Not because you deserve it, but because I believe people can learn." The message struck Evelyn with a mix of relief and bitter recognition. As she read Ava's words again slowly and carefully, it became clear to her that Ava had not forgiven her merely to console her own wounded pride. Instead, Ava had simply acknowledged the apology as a sign that Evelyn, once blinded by her own self-assuredness, had finally seen the truth. That truth was as harsh as it was undeniable. Her long-held belief in her own fairness was nothing more than a shield to cover the deep biases that had, for years, dictated her every decision. Evelyn leaned back against the couch, her face hidden behind her hands, feeling a mix of shame and a strange sense of clarity. The humiliation, the public shaming, the corporate fallout, none of it mattered as much as the realization that she had lost something essential. She had lost her blind faith in rules that had once justified her every action. Ava's silent strength, her calm composure in the midst of disgrace, had forced the world to finally take notice of what was usually ignored. In that transformative moment, as the aftermath of Flight 748 continued to ripple through the industry, Evelyn understood that the change must be radical. Her father had already begun launching mandatory inclusion training sessions, not just checking boxes, but with real human interaction aimed at unlearning long-held prejudices. And while Evelyn now sat at home with the quiet sting of suspension echoing through empty halls, she knew that the lessons of that flight were far from over. The injustice she had endured would serve as a beacon for change, a promise that no one would ever again be told to move simply because they didn't look the part. Evelyn Matthews sat quietly as the silence pressed in on her like an unyielding winter chill. The weight of that fateful flight still echoed in her heart, and though she had forgiven herself long ago, the memory of being unrightfully removed from first class still burned. In the days that followed, her carefully crafted apology from Claire Henson, delivered with heartfelt remorse and honesty, had begun to make waves. Evelyn received a handwritten letter from Claire that chilled and warmed her at the same time. In the letter, Claire admitted that she had been trained by life to keep her head down and not cause trouble, yet now recognized the dangerous power of silence when wielded by those in authority. Claire's words poured out about how she had been blinded by bias, how she had never expected her actions to ripple out so far, and how she hoped to never hurt anyone again. For Evelyn, who had always been treated like she belonged simply because she had a powerful father behind her, that quiet admission was both a balm and a warning. It served as a promise that others might someday be spared humiliation. Evelyn smiled, knowing that real change begins with a quiet, honest truth that resonates long after the noise fades. Benjamin and Abigail Monroe stepped onto the jet bridge as if they'd done it 100 times before, their first-class boarding passes tucked neatly in a leather wallet. In Benjamin's hand was a small box wrapped in gold paper, a birthday present for their grandmother. They were dressed just right for first class. Benjamin in his navy blazer, Abigail in a simple white blouse. They smiled at the gate agent who scanned their passes and said, "Enjoy your flight." They didn't know how fast that moment of calm would shatter. Inside the cabin, the soft glow of overhead lights fell on rows of leather seats. A few passengers sipped orange juice, others read the morning paper. Benjamin and Abigail found their seats in row 2, slipped their bags into the overhead bin, then settled in. Abigail tucked the gift box under the seat in front of her, her heart light with anticipation. Benjamin leaned toward the window and watched the tarmac bustle below them. That's when Heather Thompson appeared. She was tall, her uniform crisp, but her eyes were cold. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through half the cabin. "Are you sure you're in the right seats?" Benjamin straightened up. "We are in first class," he said, holding out his pass. Heather barely glanced at it. "First-class seats are reserved for first-class passengers," she said, as though checking a rule book in her head. She leaned closer, took the passes, then studied them with exaggerated care. When she handed them back without a word, Benjamin forced a steady smile. Abigail's fingers curled tightly around the gift box. After a few minutes of silence, during which the engines started their low rumble, Heather returned. She planted herself in front of them and folded her arms. "I need you to move to the back of the plane," she said, her tone flat and final. Benjamin sat up. "Why?" he asked, his voice polite but firm. "Those seats are needed for other passengers," she answered, with no hint of explanation. She didn't say who those passengers were or why they mattered more. Abigail leaned toward Benjamin, voice trembling. "We didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. Benjamin looked straight ahead. "We're not moving unless the captain asks us to." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of his family name, even though Heather didn't know it yet. Heather's jaw clenched. "Fine," she snapped. "I'll call security." Her voice rose, drawing stares from every seat. Abigail braced herself, eyes glistening with tears, but she stayed silent. She pulled her phone from her purse and began typing fast, her knuckles white. Benjamin watched her, his face tight with patience. Heather stormed down the aisle toward the cockpit phone, her heels clicking like a judge's gavel. Passengers turned to watch, some whispering, others staring in stunned silence. Heather's cheeks were flushed as she picked up the handset. "Captain, I have 2 passengers refusing to move. I need ground security here, now." A pause, then a deep, calm voice filled the cabin. "This is Richard Monroe." Heather froze. The entire first-class cabin held its breath. "Would you like to repeat that?" Heather's hand trembled on the phone. The Monroe siblings are refusing to comply, sir." "I see," Richard's voice replied quietly. "Can you explain why you're singling them out?" Around Benjamin and Abigail, eyes shifted, some with confusion, others with a growing respect. Heather swallowed, her bravado gone. In that moment, the airport noise, the overhead bins clicking shut, even Abigail's silent tears felt far away. All that mattered was the name Benjamin and Abigail bore, and the power it carried. And suddenly, Heather realized the mistake she'd made. She lowered the handset, her face pale, as the full weight of her actions settled on her shoulders. Benjamin sat back in his seat, his arms relaxed this time. Abigail leaned against him, her breathing steadier. All around them, the cabin was charged with a new energy, quiet admiration for two young passengers who refused to be humiliated, and the unmistakable fear that comes when you find out exactly who you've wronged. Heather Thompson stood rigid against the galley storage compartment, her knuckles white as she gripped its edge. She could still hear Richard Monroe's calm voice echoing through the intercom, low and measured but laced with authority. That was the same voice she had watched in a sterile training video once, a distant face in a corporate orientation. Now it was real. It shook her to the core. She tried to steady her breathing, but each inhalation felt hot and ragged. She glanced toward the front of the cabin, where Benjamin Monroe and Abigail Monroe sat side by side. Their eyes met hers for a fleeting second, calm but unyielding. In that moment, she knew she was cornered, judged not just as a flight attendant, but as someone whose worst assumptions had just come back to haunt her. The hush in first class was suffocating. Every passenger was waiting for the next move. Some pretended to scroll through their phones, but leaned forward as if straining to catch the slightest whisper. Others looked directly at Heather with that mix of pity and satisfaction that only comes when you see someone powerful brought low. She had spent 12 years building her reputation, 12 years of logging flight hours, collecting commendations, earning promotions, and never once having to explain herself. And here, on a plane full of strangers, every step she'd climbed felt like it was collapsing beneath her. She pressed her back against the cool compartment door and tried to summon confidence. Instead, she felt the cold sweat bead on her neck. Her mind raced through the moment she had demanded Benjamin and Abigail move. At the time, she had convinced herself it was protocol. First-class seats were precious. But underneath that self-justification lay something darker. She had seen two well-dressed teenagers with a gift box wrapped in gleaming gold paper, and she had decided they didn't belong. Her snap judgment was as old as fear itself. Now that judgment had unfurled into her worst nightmare. Benjamin sat with his chest straight, shoulders squared, and eyes forward. His calm was deliberate, like a refusal carved in stone. Abigail leaned slightly toward him, her small hands still wrapped around the gold gift box. Tears had dried on her cheeks, but her jaw was set. They didn't shout or plead, they just waited, their silence twisted as she watched them. How dare they turn the tables on her? How dare they demand respect from someone who thought they were beneath her? Then the intercom buzzed again. Heather flinched as the cabin filled with Richard Monroe's voice one more time. "This is Richard Monroe. Until further notice, this flight is delayed. All ground operations have been contacted. The crew member responsible for the incident is to be immediately removed from active duty." A collective gasp rippled through first class. Some passengers raised their phones, pressing record with careful stealth. Heather felt her knees go weak. She didn't need to look around to see the disbelief and the pity in every pair of eyes. A young steward took the phone from her trembling hand and turned toward Heather. "The captain wants to see you," he said softly. There was no judgment in his voice, only sorrow. Heather walked down the aisle, each step interminable. She passed rows of passengers whose polite side glances collided with secret triumph. It felt like walking through a gauntlet of silent jurors. In the cockpit, Captain Lawrence sat with his arms crossed. His face was calm but stern. On the screen beside him, the airline's regional operations manager loomed, his expression icy. Heather perched on the fold-down seat, her uniform too tight against her shaking body. The manager wasted no time. He spoke with clipped precision. "Miss Thompson, you have been named in a report filed directly by Richard Monroe. He alleges you verbally harassed and attempted to forcibly relocate two first-class passengers, his niece and nephew, without cause." Heather tried to speak, but her voice stuck in her throat. "I didn't know who they were," came out in a tiny whisper. The man's gaze hardened. "That is the problem. Their tickets were valid. Your behavior was not." His words hit her like a fist. She closed her eyes, tasting the bitter tang of regret. The silence stretched before the verdict came. When it did, it was a cold blow. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from active duty. You will be escorted to the administration office upon landing. If you choose not to comply, security will meet us before we even reach the gate." Captain Lawrence watched her carefully, as if waiting for her to argue. She didn't. She barely had the strength to move. Heather stumbled out of the cockpit. Her shoulders slumped and her face drained of color. The cabin's hush felt heavier now, like the weight of every whisper and every recording. She made her way to the rear jump seat, but did not sit. Instead, she stood with her back to the galley wall, eyes fixed on the floor. Every uniformed colleague who passed offered no comfort. They looked away, unwilling to meet the gaze of a woman falling from grace. Claire, a junior flight attendant freshly on board, approached her hesitantly and asked if she was okay. Heather stared at her, her lips parting but no sound coming out. Claire swallowed and took a small step closer. "I didn't expect it to go this far," she said quietly. Heather let out a bitter laugh that died in her throat. The trainee was right. It had only taken one phone call, one calm voice, one refusal to back down. As tears pricked Heather's eyes, she realized just how far she had fallen. For a moment, she flashed back to the trembling hands that had demanded Benjamin and Abigail move. She remembered the smug satisfaction she'd felt, imagining she was protecting first-class privileges. Now her own world had been upended in a single moment of prejudice. From the front of the plane, Captain Lawrence's voice drifted through the speakers again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be holding on the runway a few more minutes. Thank you for your patience." The announcement was perfunctory, but had a different edge now. Passengers exchanged knowing looks. They understood that this delay was not mechanical or weather-related. It was personal. It was Heather's reckoning. Abigail rested her head on Benjamin's shoulder, her small form trembling as she fought to hold back fresh tears. Benjamin reached over and gently squeezed her hand. A middle-aged man across the aisle leaned toward them and said, "I just want you to know I saw everything. You both handled it with so much grace." Benjamin nodded with quiet gratitude. Abigail managed a small smile. In that moment, Heather Thompson was more than a flight attendant in trouble. She was the embodiment of a single snap judgment's power to destroy. As the minutes crawled by, Heather pressed against the wall, her uniform feeling like chainmail that no longer protected her. She flicked her gaze toward Benjamin and Abigail one last time. They sat calm and poised, their dignity intact. The gift box glinted between Abigail's knees, a small symbol of love and family that had nothing to do with status or entitlement. It spoke of kindness and respect, qualities Heather had betrayed. When the plane finally taxied toward the gate, passengers sprang to life. Some quietly applauded as security personnel boarded. The sound was muted but unmistakable. It was not a celebration of cruelty. It was a celebration of justice. Heather straightened her shoulders as two officers approached. She lifted her chin, though her eyes brimmed with tears. She did not shout apologies or excuses. She knew none could undo what she had done. Benjamin stood and offered Abigail his arm. "Come on," he said softly. They gathered their belongings and rose together. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. As they passed Heather Thompson in the aisle, Abigail paused and looked her in the eye. No words were exchanged. Abigail's gaze was steady and forgiving. It was as if she understood Heather's humanity even now. Then the siblings stepped off the plane into a corridor of blinking cameras and hushed whispers. The door closed behind them and the cabin lights brightened. Heather was guided to the front door where she would face more than just corporate discipline. She would have to live with the memory of a moment when fear trumped compassion. As security led her away, passengers turned back to their seats or to one another, sharing relieved smiles and quiet nods. The tension dissolved into a low hum of conversation. Benjamin and Abigail emerged from the jet bridge into the bright terminal. Abigail clutched her grandmother's gift box tightly. Benjamin placed a comforting arm around her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Abigail nodded and blinked back tears. "We did it," she whispered. "We made them listen." He smiled down at her, pride shining in his eyes. In the end, the siblings had not raised their voices or created a scene. They simply held their ground and let the truth speak. Their quiet courage had unleashed Heather Thompson's fall, and for everyone who witnessed it, that silent victory felt like justice served in the purest form. A powerful reminder that respect is never given lightly, but must be earned through kindness and humility. Abigail Monroe rested her head on Benjamin's shoulder, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to fly," she said, wiping away the last of her tears. "I was excited. I've never been in first class before." Benjamin shifted so her back was supported by the seat, his hand sliding across the armrest toward her. "I know," he said softly. "You didn't do anything wrong." He sounded calm, but inside his chest, his heart pounded like a drum. The memory of Heather Thompson's cruel command, "Move to the back," still reverberated in his mind. They had done nothing but sit quietly clutching a small gold-wrapped gift box, yet they'd been treated like trespassers. Across the aisle, a woman in a tweed jacket with silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears leaned forward. Her kind eyes glistened with empathy. "I saw the whole thing," she said, voice gentle. "You two didn't deserve that, and she knew it even before your uncle spoke." Abigail offered her a grateful smile. "Thank you," she replied, voice trembling. The woman nodded. "I've flown with this airline for more than 20 years. That voice you heard over the intercom isn't just some rich executive. He's the reason this company exists. He built it from the ground up." Benjamin's chest tightened. He already knew his uncle Richard Monroe's power was enormous, but hearing it reinforced the scale of Heather's mistake. In the cramped galley at the rear of the cabin, Heather Thompson pressed her back against the wall, her eyes unfocused. 12 years with the airline, overnight red-eye flights through storms, managing medical emergencies at 30,000 feet, calming panicked passengers. None of it had prepared her for this. She'd earned every promotion through strict discipline, enforcing policies with an iron fist, but respect wasn't a rule in the manual. It was earned, and she'd squandered it in a single moment. The roar of the engines felt distant. All she could hear now was her own ragged breathing. Claire, the junior attendant, approached hesitantly, paper trembling in her hand. "Miss Thompson," she said softly, "this just came through from headquarters." Heather's heart lurched. She accepted the message with a quivering grip. As she scanned the first line, "Ms. Heather Thompson is to be removed from duty upon arrival and escorted directly to administration for termination review." Her lungs constricted. It was more than suspension. This was total removal. She felt the floor tilt beneath her as the words sank in. They didn't just want her off the flight. They wanted her gone from the company. The paper slipped from Heather's hand, fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. She had imagined a private conversation, perhaps a chance to explain herself. Instead, she'd been erased without a hearing. Claire cleared her throat. "They also request your badge and security key be turned in before we land." Heather stared up, disbelief washed over her. "Before we land?" Claire nodded. "They don't want you stepping off the plane in uniform." The humiliation settled like a stone in her stomach. Not even for gross negligence had she ever seen such swift, merciless action. With shaking fingers, Heather unclipped her badge. The polished brass letters, "Heather Thompson, Senior Cabin Supervisor," stared back at her, mocking her. She'd fought for that badge, worn it with pride, believed it granted her authority and safety. Now it was plastic and worthless. She handed it to Claire, who took it without a word. Heather sank into the jump seat, uniform still pristine but powerless, like a knight stripped of armor. At the front of the cabin, power had shifted. Benjamin and Abigail Monroe sat in their seats, calm as stone statues. The gift box lay between Abigail's knees, its gold paper catching the overhead lights. The hush in first class was thick, charged with a new electricity. Passengers had stopped their whispered conversations. Even the baby in row 5 was oddly quiet. Everyone sensed they were witnessing a reckoning. Benjamin leaned back, folding his arms. He stared at nothing, just beyond the seats ahead, as if the horizon lay inside his mind. Abigail rubbed her thumb along the ribbon of the gift box, her breathing steady. They didn't smile or flirt with the camera. They did nothing. Their silent resolve was their victory. It had been easy because their strength came not from aggression but from dignity and the knowledge that their uncle would not tolerate injustice against his family. Claire re-emerged from the galley, moving with a different air. She approached Benjamin and Abigail, offering them water and cookies with a tentative smile. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" she asked, voice polite but hushed. Abigail shook her head, her lips curving in a small, appreciative smile. Benjamin simply nodded. Claire gave them a respectful glance and stepped away, her posture softer than before. The crew knew exactly who deserved respect now. Heather sat in the back, watching Claire move through the aisle. She had once led this cabin with an iron will. Now she was a ghost at the party. Every face that passed spared her a glance of pity or scorn. She closed her eyes, the image of 2 teenagers, calm and unbroken, flashing behind her eyelids. How had she judged them so quickly? How had she convinced herself they were intruders, when in truth they'd been born to belong? Her mind drifted back to the boarding passes. She had scanned them twice. They were valid, perfectly valid. But that morning something in her prickled, a quiet alarm that whispered these kids weren't like the others. 2 black teenagers in first class, neat and polite. Some part of her thought they were too polished, didn't match her idea of first-class passengers. It was not in any policy, not in her training. It was a prejudice she'd never questioned until now. "In the front," Benjamin whispered to Abigail. "Remember what Mama always says, nobody's worth more than anyone else." Abigail rested her head on his shoulder. "I know," she said, voice soft, "but it still hurts." He wrapped an arm around her. "We'll be okay," he promised. "We have each other, and we've got Uncle Richard's support. And we did the right thing." Abigail squeezed his hand. "Yeah," she whispered, "we did." Across the aisle, the older woman with the kind eyes patted Abigail's arm. "Your uncle did good," she said. "He saved the day." Abigail nodded, her eyes bright. The gratitude radiated from her like sunlight. All around them people shared glances, silent acknowledgments of solidarity. The hush was no longer oppressive. It was a sign of communal understanding, a promise that injustice would not stand unchallenged. Heather listened to the hum of conversation slowly rising behind her, tinged with reflection rather than small talk. She realized the plane was more than a vessel. It was a microcosm of a world grappling with fairness and respect. And she had tipped the scales toward cruelty. She closed her eyes, imagining the scenes she had orchestrated. The firmness of her voice telling 2 kids they didn't belong, their stunned compliance as she waved them away, the memory burned inside her. From the intercom, Captain Lawrence's voice returned. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff. We've been cleared to proceed. Thank you, passengers, for your patience." It was the routine announcement it had always been, but not anymore. The way he said it, measured and low, carried an unspoken warning. Heather did not respond. She sat motionless, no longer a member of the crew, no longer part of the machine she had once commanded. Claire passed Heather on her way to secure the front galley. She paused, offering a sympathetic look, then continued on without a word. It was a kindness that cut deeper than any reprimand. In one silent gesture, Claire acknowledged Heather's loss and Heather's humanity, but it was too late for mercy. The plane began to taxi, its engines rumbling against the runway. The vibration under the seat felt foreign to Heather. She was no longer in control. She was just another passenger, punished, humiliated, alone. As the aircraft turned toward the runway, the cabin lights dimmed. The overhead bins clicked shut. The final boarding call had long since passed. Benjamin and Abigail sat upright, their eyes fixed straight ahead. The seatbelt sign glowed above their heads, a bright reminder of the journey's continuation. Abigail clutched the gift box tight as though it tethered her to normalcy. Benjamin folded his hands in his lap. This quiet tableau was their statement. Dignity triumphs over bullying, and respect outlives prejudice. Heather's thoughts spun as the wheels lifted off the ground. She listened to the soft hush of the cabin as everyone sank into their seats. No one chatted about weather or flight routes. Everyone carried the same unspoken understanding that they had witnessed a wrong righted. Abigail closed her eyes, leaning against Benjamin's arm. He reached out and patted her hand. They both knew the flight would land, the engines would shut down, and life would go on. But for one moment, up in the sky, justice had flown first class. As the plane climbed through layers of atmosphere, Heather stared at her empty jump seat. It felt like looking into an abyss. She had lost everything in that moment: her badge, her authority, her pride. But most of all, she had lost herself. At 30,000 feet, untethered from the rules she once enforced, she realized the simplest truth. Authority doesn't come from a shiny badge or a crisp uniform. It comes from treating people with fairness and compassion. And that was a lesson she had learned too late. Down below, the city lights blurred into a stream of gold as the aircraft soared toward night. Inside the cabin, the quiet settled like a soft blanket. Passengers closed their eyes, stirred occasionally by the gentle hum. Abigail drifted off to sleep, her curls brushing Benjamin's jacket. Benjamin stared out the small oval window at the dark horizon, the gold gift box in his lap, a symbol of a journey far greater than any destination. In the back, Heather Thompson remained seated, invisible and alone, grappling with the wreckage of her actions. And for everyone on that flight, it was a journey they would remember long after the landing gear touched down. A story of injustice confronted, of courage in silent defiance, and of the mighty brought low by their own cruelty. It was a reminder that respect is precious, that prejudice can unravel a career, and that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply standing firm in what is right. Claire moved quietly down the aisle and set 2 bottles of cold water on Abigail's tray table without waiting for a reply. "You look like you might need these," she said softly. Abigail reached for one, her fingers brushing Claire's hand as though in thanks. Claire offered a small nod and stepped back. In that gentle gesture, there was more kindness than anything Heather Thompson had shown all flight. Abigail unwrapped the cap and took a slow sip, resting the bottle against the ribbon on the gift box. "Are we still landing on time?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Claire paused, glancing first at Benjamin, then toward the front of the cabin. "Yes," she said quietly, "we will land on schedule. But when you step off the plane, you may see some people waiting at the gate." Benjamin turned his head, his brow knit. "What kind of people?" he asked. Claire took a breath. "Corporate visitors, from the very top. Your uncle is not just waiting, he is bringing people with him." Abigail's eyes widened beneath the cabin lights. "Why?" she said in a small voice. Claire swallowed. "Because he is treating this not like an error by cabin crew, but like a public statement. He wants everyone, inside and outside the company, to see the consequences." The implication hung heavy between them. Claire's voice held a tremor when she said that, and then she moved away, her expression unreadable. In the rear galley, Heather Thompson still sat, pressed against the wall, staring as though the white steel panel would offer her some escape. The jump seat felt harder today, the edges cutting into her legs like a reminder that she no longer belonged. Her uniform, once so crisp and authoritative, felt heavy with shame. Her name tag lay gone from her collar. She had surrendered it, but its absence pressed against her like a ghost. She closed her eyes, trying to replay the events in sequence. The boarding passes had been fine. She had scanned them twice. Still, she had decided they did not belong. Two neatly dressed black teenagers in first class. Something inside her had burned with impatience that they had taken seats she had reserved for others. She had not questioned that feeling. She had acted on it. Now she felt that action like a wound that throbbed with every passing second. Would someone meet her at the door? Would she be forced off the plane in front of everyone? She pictured Richard Monroe standing at the gate, flanked by executives and security officers. She swallowed hard, her throat constricting. She had always told herself that passengers' opinions did not matter, that her job was to manage the cabin, not to make friends. Yet now, with her career dangling on a thread, she realized how much of her power had depended on fear, not respect. Fear did not protect you when the people above you stopped defending you. She thought of that as the plane dipped toward the runway, its descent smooth, but her own descent into disgrace felt like a nosedive. The captain's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent in about 10 minutes. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare the cabin for arrival." "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Heather did not move. The word crew felt hollow now. She was no longer part of one. The seatbelt sign lit up above her head with a soft chime. She checked that her own belt was fastened, though she knew she would not be going anywhere until they allowed her to step off. Around her, the cabin filled with the usual preparations. Passengers clicked their belts into place, folded away trays, stowed headsets. But the usual buzz of conversation was gone. It had been replaced by an undercurrent of tension so thick you could almost taste it. Checklists were completed, overhead bins latched, lights dimmed. Heather's stomach twisted as she imagined someone calling her name. Heather Thompson, Senior Cabin Supervisor, Escort to Administration. It played in her mind like a dirge. She had always prided herself on flawless execution, on maintaining order. Yet here she sat, paralyzed, stripped of her badge, stripped of her dignity. At row 2, Benjamin and Abigail remained composed. Benjamin kept his arms folded, his gaze steady as though waiting for a performance. Abigail picked at the ribbon on the gift box, her lips pressed together. They had been through storms before, storms of whispered suspicion, unfair glances. But this was the first storm that had threatened not just their comfort, but their innocence. They had not cried out, they had not raised their voices, they had simply waited, letting the storm pass through. Across the aisle, the silver-hailed woman brushed away a loose strand of hair and leaned forward again. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked Abigail in a voice gentle as cotton. Abigail nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "I am just ready to be off this plane." The woman smiled sympathetically and settled back in her seat. She had witnessed the entire ordeal, and many others had too. Some had recorded it on phones, others had watched in silence, knowing that no bystander intervention had come when it was needed. In the cockpit, Captain Lawrence monitored the instruments and watched runway lights approach. He had flown through thunderheads that could have torn the skin off the fuselage. He had handled unresponsive passengers and navigated avalanches of mechanical issues. Yet, nothing felt as urgent as the scene unfolding in his cabin. He did not need Richard Monroe's orders to know that this incident would be discussed in boardrooms. He felt its weight in every control click. Claire stood in the front galley, hands clasped behind her back, waiting for the final approach. She looked at Heather as if that would offer comfort, but Heather did not meet her eyes. Claire understood. It was not her place to offer explanations. The plane would land, and Heather would walk down the aisle into a squad of corporate personnel. The cabin lights brightened as the wheels touched the runway with a soft thud at exactly 15,000 feet per minute descent. The engines whined against the ground, decelerating, and the cabin filled with the faint vibration of rubber on tarmac. Passengers exhaled. The usual murmur of relief was joined by quiet speculation. Will she really be fired? Will he actually be waiting? Some leaned forward, trying to glimpse through the front cabin door. Heather sat stiffly, as though immobilized by shame. She dared not look up. Movement felt like a betrayal. She did not want to see the lines of suited figures in the jet bridge or the stern face of Richard Monroe, but she knew she could not help herself. She raised her head slowly, barely a centimeter, and peered toward the front of the plane. There, framed by the doorway, stood Richard Monroe in a charcoal gray suit that was cut to measure. He was flanked by 2 security officers in dark uniforms and a woman holding a clipboard. Her features were hard but impassive. They looked like a somber honor guard assembling for an official ceremony. They looked like judgment incarnate. Passengers watched the tableau. Some rose to collect belongings, but their eyes never left the scene. A hush fell as corporate representatives stepped onto the plane, their shoes clicking softly on the carpet. The first officer opened the door wider, and a soft flood of fluorescent terminal lights spilled into the cabin. Heather Thompson rose on trembling legs. Her uniform felt like lead. Her cheeks burned with the memory of every harsh word she had spoken. She straightened her back, though her shoulders threatened to buckle. She took one step, then another, her eyes cast downward. Benjamin and Abigail watched her approach as the cabin filled with a silence that seemed impossible. Every bubble wrap of a headphone adjustment echoed like a shout. The ambient in-flight music in the background felt like a cruel soundtrack. Claire hovered near the front, ready to hand over the plane once authority transferred. Passengers set aside magazines and newspapers, craning their necks. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy with the sense that they were about to witness a reckoning. Near the doorway, Heather stood before Richard Monroe. The corporate team formed a semicircle, giving space for the confrontation. Richard's face was calm and controlled. He did not raise his voice. He did not show anger or pity. He simply looked at Heather with a quiet intensity that spoke volumes. Heather's mouth opened, but no words came. Her voice had deserted her. She thought perhaps an apology would save her, but she realized this was not about this one flight. It was about a message that needed to be sent. Prejudice has consequences, no matter how well hidden. Richard Monroe spoke softly but firmly. "Heather Thompson, you have been removed from duty effective immediately. You will report to our administration office upon arrival. You are no longer authorized to wear this uniform or represent our company." His words were as precise as a scalpel. They cut through every defense she might have had. Heather nodded, unable to speak. She felt tears gather at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to apologize, to beg for mercy, to explain that she had acted in fear and not malice. But the tremor in her voice made that impossible. She simply lowered her head and stepped aside. Benjamin rose then, his body tall and composed. Abigail stood with him, clutching the gift box to her chest. They walked past Heather with measured steps. Benjamin paused as he reached her side and offered a small nod. Abigail gave Heather a quiet look, one that spoke of empathy rather than triumph. "It said you did wrong, but I believe you can learn better." Heather watched them go, tears slipping down her cheeks. There was no anger in their faces. There was only quiet dignity. The sight pierced her heart. She realized she had not just lost her job. She had lost the respect she thought she commanded. She had lost the compassion she could have shown but denied. The plane emptied row by row. Passengers filed past Heather, some whispering condolences, others offering sympathetic glances. A few held out their hands in silent support. Claire remained near Heather's side once the siblings had left. She placed a gentle hand on Heather's arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Heather did not respond. Words felt too small now. At the bottom of the aisle, Benjamin and Abigail paused and turned. Abigail raised the gift box toward Claire. Claire accepted it with a surprised smile and tucked it under her arm. "Thank you," the girl said, so quietly that only Claire heard. Claire nodded, her eyes moist. As they stepped into the jet bridge, the corporate team fell into step behind them, escorting them toward the terminal. Richard Monroe walked just behind his niece and nephew, watching over them like a guardian. The group moved forward, leaving Heather and the rest of the crew standing in the cabin. Heather stood alone for a moment, the cabin emptier than it had ever been. She touched the seat back where she had sat and remembered the weight of her uniform, the voice of authority she had so easily wielded. Now, that authority was gone. She glanced at the cabin windows and watched the siblings pass under the bright terminal lights, their figures small against the glass wall. The distant murmur of rolling luggage and airport announcements filtered back to her. It sounded like a distant life. Claire guided Heather to the cockpit door. Captain Lawrence stood there, his expression unreadable. He looked at Heather once, then offered her a single word, "Goodbye." Heather nodded and walked through the doorway, her footsteps quiet. The cockpit door clicked shut behind her. In the empty cabin, the crew began the final checks to prepare for the next boarding. They moved with purpose, but weighed down by the knowledge that this flight would be remembered for what had happened here, not for smooth takeoff or timely arrival, but for a moment when two teenagers held firm against injustice, and when power was wielded too cruelly. Outside the plane in the terminal, Benjamin and Abigail emerged into a corridor bright with fluorescent lights. Abigail squeezed Benjamin's hand. "It felt good to be off that plane," she said, her voice tinged with relief. Benjamin gave her a small smile. "We made them listen," he said softly, "and they did." He paused and looked back over his shoulder at the plane, now silent on the tarmac. Claire appeared at the jet bridge exit, the small gift box in her hand. She gave a small wave and mouthed goodbye to Abigail. Abigail waved back. Then the siblings stepped down the final few feet into the arms of loved ones waiting beyond the glass doors. In that moment, the story reached its climax not with a shout, but with a gentle closing of a door. The injustice that had hung in the air was replaced by a wave of solidarity and respect. For Heather Thompson, there would be paperwork and meetings and a reckoning to face. For Benjamin and Abigail Monroe, there would be a new memory to carry. A story of courage, of quiet strength, and of the day first class truly belonged to those who showed respect and stood firm in their right. As the terminal doors closed behind them, the cabin remained still, the lights dimmed, and the hum of the engines faded to a quiet memory. The wings of the plane glinted under the hangar lights, a silent witness to everything that had unfolded inside. And somewhere deep within that metal hull, an echo of a lesson resonated. True authority comes not from a badge or a voice raised in command, but from the power of integrity and the unshakable belief that everyone deserves respect. Heather Thompson pressed her back against the cold metal of the galley wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the entire cabin could hear it. Through the narrow aisle framed by half-emptied seats, she glimpsed Richard Monroe standing just beyond the door. He was impeccable in his charcoal gray suit, the crisp lines of his jacket resting on his broad shoulders with effortless authority. He didn't look angry, he simply watched with a steady calm that felt more terrifying than any shout. Behind him, two uniformed security officers stood at attention, their posture rigid, their eyes fixed on Heather, as though waiting for her to stumble. She could feel their measured breathing like a tide rolling in, ready to wash over her. In that moment, she realized she was utterly exposed. The faces of disembarking passengers drifted past her. Some stared. One man paused for just an instant and looked directly at Heather, his eyes apologetic. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. You are the reason our flight was delayed. You are the one who treated two polite teenagers like intruders. Heather swallowed, the bitterness rising in her throat. She had once believed that 12 years of flawless service, the commendations, the promotions, and the ironclad cabin protocols would shield her. Now, every badge she'd earned felt like a target aimed squarely at her chest. Up front, Benjamin Monroe sat with his back straight against the leather upholstery. His shoulders were relaxed, but his posture was unyielding, like a tree rooted deep in the earth. Abigail clutched the small gold-wrapped box in her lap, her fingers tracing the ribbon as though anchoring herself against the storm of humiliation Heather had begged upon them. Their uncle, Richard, stood poised at the front door, watching each of Heather's faltering steps as she prepared to make her exit. He had halted a whole flight with one silent call, and now she was making that exit in front of everyone, her punishment as deliberate and public as her initial injustice. Passengers drifted past Benjamin and Abigail, many offering nods of respect or murmured apologies. A woman in a business suit paused and whispered something to her companion, words too soft for Heather to catch, but kindness dripped from the tone. Another older man tipped his hat slightly, a gesture of solidarity that stung more than any insult. Heather watched from afar as those same faces had once averted their eyes when she barked for Benjamin and Abigail to move. Now they were the ones offering silent amends. She felt the weight of every glance, every whispered condolence, and she wanted to vanish into the overhead paneling. Claire's soft voice called from the front galley. Benjamin and Abigail looked up as she approached, her steps measured and her expression gentle. "You're free to step off now," she said in a whisper. "But Mr. Monroe asked that you wait until all crew members have disembarked. He would like to speak to both of you." Abigail's brow furrowed. "Is it about Heather Thompson?" Claire nodded, her eyes full of sympathy for both the siblings and for the woman who was about to face her reckoning. "About everything," Claire added softly. The siblings exchanged a glance and sank back into their seats, the air around them thick with anticipation. In the rear jump seat, Heather fumbled with the zipper of her small overnight bag, her fingers shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Claire returned and knelt beside her, gently guiding Heather's hands. "Here, let me help you," she said quietly. Heather's eyes brimmed with tears, tears of shame, of fear, of regret. "Are they really going to do it right there in front of everyone?" she whispered. Claire's throat tightened. "They already are," she replied. Heather's heart felt as though it had shriveled in her chest. Behind her, the cabin doors stood open, the light from the terminal flooding in. In the doorway stood Benjamin and Abigail, waiting under the watchful gaze of Richard Monroe. Claire lingered by the exit, her face a picture of compassion. Abigail stepped forward first, the gold gift box held like a shield in front of her. Benjamin followed, his posture unwavering. Passengers rose to their feet, creating a corridor of silence that guided the siblings toward their uncle. Richard offered no smile, yet his eyes softened as they met theirs. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. Abigail nodded, her face composed, though her eyes glistened. "Yes, sir," she answered. He exhaled slowly, the faintest relief passing through him. "Good," he said. Then he motioned toward a waiting lounge off to the side. "Let's talk away from the crowd." With that, the siblings slipped into a frosted glass waiting area, flanked by two discreet staff members. Passengers watched them go, some straining to catch a glimpse, others whispering as they filed past toward the baggage claims. The cabin doors closed with a soft hiss, sealing Heather's departure and the siblings' private audience. Inside the lounge, leather chairs were arranged around a small coffee table. Richard stood for a moment before taking a seat behind Abigail and Benjamin's chairs. He watched them carefully, his hands folded on his lap. "You handled that scene better than most adults I know," he said. "You could have shouted, you could have yelled or caused a scene, but you didn't." Benjamin shrugged modestly. It wouldn't have helped. He met his uncle's gaze. Abigail leaned forward. "Aunt Heather's career is over, isn't it?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Richard's expression turned somber. "Yes, she has been terminated. Her record is flagged. I meant it when I said I wanted this to be a public statement. She lost her position because she chose who belonged in those seats and decided no one would challenge her. In public, in first class, where everyone saw." A flicker of regret passed through Abigail's eyes. "I don't want her to lose everything," she said quietly. Richard leaned back. She didn't lose everything because of you. She lost everything because of her own choices, and because she refused to correct herself when she realized she was wrong. His gaze met Abigail's. You didn't get her fired, she did that on her own. Benjamin looked thoughtful. Do you think people will learn from this? He asked. Richard paused, tapping a finger on the armrest. Some will, he said. Others won't. But the people who matter, those who remember this story, yes, they will learn. He stood and adjusted his cufflinks. You too did more with your silence and composure than most could with 1,000 words. You gave me a chance to hold someone accountable without chaos. For that I'm grateful. A soft knock came at the door. A staff member peeked in and said, Press is gathering near the terminal windows. Security is managing the crowd. Richard nodded. We're done here, he said. He offered Abigail his arm, which she accepted. Benjamin followed, slipping arms linked with his sister's. They walked out of the lounge, stepping back into the fluorescent light of the terminal. Outside the cabin door, press cameras clicked and whirred, reporters craning to record the siblings as they emerged. Security officers parted, and corporate executives looked on with a proud seriousness. Benjamin and Abigail paused under the bright lights, the gift box still in Abigail's hands, and shared a brief look. Then together they walked toward their waiting car, their steps steady and assured. Heather Thompson's exit had been the flight's most dramatic moment, but the siblings' exit was the one everyone remembered. The grace with which they carried a small token of love through an atmosphere charged with tension, and as they disappeared into the crowd, the lights of the terminal reflected off the polished floors, a silent testament to the fact that dignity and respect remain the highest seats anyone can hold. Behind them, the cabin stood empty but for a few crew members completing final checks. Claire returned to her station, placing the gift box on a shelf where it served as a quiet symbol of the day's events. Captain Lawrence sat in the cockpit for a moment longer, staring out at the runway. Then he powered down systems and stepped into the cabin, his face unreadable but his posture conveying that the story unfolding on that flight would be spoken about for a long time to come. In the days that followed, news outlets replayed the audio of Richard Monroe's calm command, showing footage of the siblings' unwavering composure. The airline updated its policies, retrained staff on bias awareness, and made a public pledge to treat every passenger with fairness. Heather Thompson's name became synonymous with the warning that prejudice can destroy a career in an instant, and through it all, Benjamin and Abigail Monroe became symbols of quiet strength, reminding everyone that sometimes the most powerful act of revenge is simply standing firm in what is right and trusting in the power of dignity to make injustice take flight. Benjamin and Abigail followed the staff member through the frosted glass door and into the quiet lounge. Richard stood by the window, his reflection haloed by the airport lights. A car will be waiting outside, he said, his voice steady. A team member will walk you down, and I'll be contacting your parents tonight. Brandon rose and offered a polite smile. We appreciate everything, he said, throat tight with the day's weight. For the first time, Richard's lips curved into a genuine, if small, smile. No, Benjamin, I appreciate you, he replied. Then he added, the airline will issue a public statement. Not a quiet memo, but a real announcement. People deserve to know what happens when those in charge abuse their position. Abigail gripped the gold-wrapped box tighter. Will it mention our names? She asked. Only if you want it to, Richard answered gently, but it will make clear who is wrong and why Heather is gone. The siblings nodded and stepped together into the corridor, leaving the conference room and the worst of the ordeal behind them. Outside the terminal doors, life throbbed on as usual. Cars pulled up, horns honked, and baggage wheels rattled across pavement. But for Benjamin and Abigail, the world felt strangely new. A black town car idled by the curb, its back door open in silent invitation. The escort gave a respectful nod and slipped away, leaving the siblings alone for the first time since boarding. Abigail released a slow breath, her fingers loosening on the gift box. She stared at the empty terminal forecourt. Do you think this will follow us? she asked, voice quiet. Benjamin sank into the leather seat beside her, glancing down at his hands. They might say we ruined her life, he admitted softly, but they'd be wrong. He met her gaze. We didn't shout, we didn't threaten. You sent one text and I stayed in my seat. She destroyed her own career. Abigail gave a small, uncertain nod. I never wanted it to go this far. I know, he replied, but it had to. The car merged into traffic, the city's skyline rising behind them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the terminal, Heather sat alone in a locked conference room. Her belongings lay in a plastic bag at her feet. Her uniform jacket was folded neatly on the table. The name tag that once gleamed on her chest was gone. Her company email had been shut down. Even before her shoes touched the terminal floor, she had been erased from every internal system. For someone who'd greeted first-class travelers for 13 years, managed cabins through storms and emergencies, this sudden invisibility felt like drowning. She stared at the blank wall, unable to find words that could explain how swiftly her life had spiraled from stability into ruin. A soft knock rattled the door. A staff member entered with a clipboard. "We need you to sign this," he said calmly. "It confirms your termination and the return of all company property." Heather stared down at the form, her eyes hollow. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," she murmured. The man offered no sympathy. He simply pointed to the signature line. Heather's hand shook as she reached for the pen. "I've trained people," she whispered. "I've worked overnight flights and medical calls, and now I'm erased for one incident." The staff member raised an eyebrow. "It wasn't one incident," he said flatly. "It was the way you acted, the way you spoke to them, the fact that you didn't stop when you realized you were wrong, and the fact that you only cared once someone powerful intervened." He slid the clipboard across the table. "You didn't get erased. You exposed yourself." Heather closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks, and signed each letter with crushing weight. When she finished, the man rose and said quietly, "You'll be escorted through the employee exit. Someone will meet you at the back for pickup. I suggest you use it." Heather's head snapped up. "Why?" she whispered. "There's already a news crew outside the main terminal," he replied. "They're covering the flight where the airline owner's niece and nephew were shouted at and the plane was grounded." Heather felt her heart plunge. Her name wasn't in the headlines yet, but it would be. Flight attendant fired after mistreating executive's family. It would be a simplified story, her face pasted beside it, and she would be the cautionary tale, proof that prejudice destroys careers. Security guards appeared in silence and guided Heather through back corridors. She rose, clutching her bag like it could shield her from the eyes she knew were already watching. Outside, a black SUV idled in a private lot. She slid into the back seat and let the door click shut behind her. The driver eased away, the airport receding in her windshield. Her thoughts spun. "Maybe I can apply at a smaller airline," she thought. "Maybe nobody will recognize me. Maybe I can lie." But her mind raced back to the termination form, the flagged record, Richard Monroe's unyielding calm. This wasn't a private dismissal. It was a public signal to every company connected to that network. Do not hire her. Seniority offered no protection today. Back in the car, carrying the siblings, Benjamin leaned his head against the cool glass. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he said after a long pause. "She had no idea who we were, and she still thought she could decide we didn't belong." Abigail turned to him, her eyes reflecting the city lights. "And now she knows we do," he continued softly. They didn't smile. They didn't celebrate. They let the weight of the day settle over them, older and wiser than when they'd boarded. Their phones buzzed, messages from family, classmates, and strangers. Someone had posted a blurry photo of their plane confrontation with the caption, "Flight attendant screams at two black teens in first class. Turns out they're the CEO's family." Abigail unlocked her phone and handed it to Benjamin. "It's everywhere already," she whispered. He scanned the messages, some questioning, some praising. One classmate writing, "Yo, I'm so proud of how you handled that. You made history today." He handed the phone back. "Don't reply yet," he said calmly. "Let Uncle Richard set the plan." Outside, Heather's car wove through the freeway, parking lots and signage blurring past. She stared at her reflection in the tinted window, her plastic bag at her side. Her career in aviation was over. No company would touch a risk labeled by that scandal. She didn't cry. She only watched the world pass by, a life unraveled by one moment of prejudice and a refusal to correct course. And in the heart of the city, two teenagers carried a small gift box that gleamed like a beacon. Their quiet courage had brought a flight attendant's reign of prejudice to a crashing halt. They hadn't had to shout. They hadn't had to fight. They had simply held their ground and changed everything. In that silent victory, they discovered that true power lies not in a badge or a raised voice, but in standing firm in one's dignity. Heather Thompson had always believed her years of service granted her immunity. 13 years climbing the ranks, 3 promotions, an unblemished record. She thought that made her untouchable. It gave her permission to judge quietly, correct loudly, and never question herself. But the silence she expected from Benjamin and Abigail proved to be her undoing. Instead of resistance, they offered calm, letting her own arrogance echo back at her. The moment she barked at 2 teenagers with valid tickets, she sealed her fate. It was their quiet dignity that shattered the illusion of her control, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because Benjamin and Abigail had not fought or screamed, they had simply waited. They sat with their heads held high, refusing to be moved unless the captain ordered it. That single act of restraint became the spark that ignited a reckoning no one saw coming. They didn't need a scene full of shouting or tears. They let their silence speak volumes. When Richard Monroe's voice came over the intercom, calm, unwavering, and lethal in its precision, it carried more weight than any policy Heather had enforced. Her authority crumbled in that moment. Within minutes, Heather's name vanished from the employee schedule. Her email address auto-replied with "This account no longer exists." Her badge no longer beeped green. She had been erased from the system, but not from memory. Passengers had recorded the confrontation on their phones, and the footage spread like wildfire. For once, the flying public rallied around the ones who had been told to move, rather than the woman who wielded her uniform like a weapon. Heather's fall was as swift as her rise had been certain. Meanwhile, in a private boardroom downtown, Richard Carter stood flanked by 2 senior executives and the communications director. A muted television displayed the breaking news. Airline suspends flight attendant after conflict with CEO's family. Below, a ticker read, "Plane grounded mid-boarding after discrimination incident." The comms director looked to Richard. "They're calling for a press conference," she said, concern flickering across her face. "Some want to know why we didn't handle this privately." Richard's jaw clenched. "Privacy is what enables this behavior," he replied. "This must be public." He folded his arms. "So what now?" the second executive asked. Richard's voice was firm. "We issue a real statement. No vague language, no 'we are aware' nonsense. We tell the public exactly why she was removed. This was not a policy violation. This was personal bias, and we do not protect that." Silence settled over the room, broken only when the communications director asked, "What about Benjamin and Abigail? Will they speak?" Richard shook his head. "They've said what they needed by staying calm. The rest is our responsibility." Back in the black town car, Benjamin and Abigail sat side by side. The city skyline blurred past tinted windows. Abigail finally spoke, her voice soft. "Why did she look at us like that? Like she already knew we didn't belong before we said a word?" Benjamin exhaled slowly, leaning his head against the seat. He reached across and squeezed her hand. "I don't know," he said, "but I think she's the one who didn't belong." The words hung in the air, and Abigail allowed herself a small, relieved nod. For the first time since boarding, her grip on the gold-wrapped gift box relaxed. Meanwhile, Heather sat alone in a quiet cafe near the airport. She had pulled the hood of her coat up and buried her eyes in a cup of untouched coffee. The plastic bag with her uniform lay beside her, as heavy as her guilt. She stared at her reflection in the dark liquid, tracing the memory of her own harsh words. A waiter hovered, uncertain. "Would you like anything else?" he asked gently. Heather shook her head. She didn't want to hear the voice of kindness. She knew reporters had already been asking about the incident. She could almost feel their questions slicing through her silence. In Richard Carter's office that evening, he poured himself a glass of water and surveyed the city as the sun dipped below the horizon. Two legal advisors sat across from him, reviewing the draft of the public statement. Richard set his glass down with a soft click. "We're not apologizing for firing her," he said. "We're apologizing to every passenger who faces bias. We'll redact her name but not the action. Let people judge based on what they saw." He tapped a folder on his desk containing the passenger manifest and internal incident log. Without opening it, he slid it aside. Let the public see the truth. The next morning arrived under a soft gray sky, the streets still damp from an overnight drizzle. Benjamin and Abigail sat in the guest suite's floor-to-ceiling window alcove, watching traffic inch by on the wet pavement. They had barely slept, yet their eyes were bright with purpose. A knock came at the door, and a staff member entered, carrying a sleek envelope. "From Mr. Carter?" she said kindly, placing it on the table. The siblings exchanged a look before Benjamin opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter on the airline stationery, a final token of respect from a company remembering its values. Outside the terminal, the hustle and bustle resumed. Commuters hurried past with coffee cups in hand, unaware of the storm whose epicenter lay just beyond the glass doors. Cleaning crews prepared the next flight. Elsewhere, Heather's ride glided down the freeway, her contract canceled, and her career in shreds. She stared out at the horizon, thinking maybe she could start over somewhere smaller. But she knew that would be impossible. Her face, her name, had become a symbol of the consequences of prejudice. A message posted online read, "Flight attendant fired after mistreating executive's family." That shorthand would follow her forever. Back in the city, social media feeds buzzed with the 6-second clip that had become legend. Heather loomed over two seated teenagers, her voice sharp and unforgiving, and Benjamin's calm reply, "We're not moving unless the captain says so." Activists, influencers, and everyday travelers shared the moment again and again, the hashtags multiplying like wildfire. Respect is not earned through a uniform. Power is not measured by how loud you speak, but by how you treat those with none. The siblings watched the coverage on a muted screen, their faces solemn but proud. As the day unfolded, it became clear this was more than a headline. It was a turning point. Airlines began reviewing their own policies. Corporate boards discussed bias training. Journalists wrote op-eds about the fragility of unchecked authority. For Heather Thompson, it was her darkest hour. But for Benjamin and Abigail Monroe, it was proof that silence and dignity could topple a legacy of prejudice. They stepped into their car, the letter from their uncle in hand, ready to face whatever came next. And somewhere beyond the city lights, a quiet victory soared on the wings of justice. Abigail unfolded the crisp stationery and read the final lines again. "You didn't raise your voices, but you spoke louder than anyone could have. You didn't ask for power, but you showed us what it looks like. What happened on that cabin was wrong, not just because of who you are, but because of what was taken for granted. Your right to be treated with dignity." Each word seemed to glow in the morning light, a direct rebuke to Heather Thompson's cruel insistence that Benjamin and Abigail did not belong simply because of their race. Benjamin watched his sister's face soften as she folded the letter and tucked it back into its envelope. Their uncle's handwriting was firm but warm. He'd closed with a line Abigail felt in her bones. "I want to thank you, not just as your uncle, but as someone who needed reminding that real change doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes, it starts with two people refusing to move. The memory of Heather's harsh glare and her snap judgment flashed through their minds, and they felt a quiet pride in the way their simple act had exposed her prejudice and shattered her illusion of control. They stepped out of the sleek, glass-walled lounge into the bright lobby, side by side, shoulders straight. A black town car waited like a promise rather than an escape. As they eased into the back seat, the moment felt different. This time they were not fleeing chaos. They were walking forward, away from the moment that had tried to strip them of their dignity and failed. Every detail of the airport seemed sharper. The hiss of automatic doors, the rumble of trolley wheels, the gleam of the polished floor. They had forced an entire industry to confront its bias. Outside, a massive digital billboard flickered with live news footage, still frames from the viral video, bold headlines scrolling by, and one clear quote from the airline's official statement: "We will not tolerate behavior that diminishes the worth of any individual. Respect is not optional, it is policy. No names, no faces, just the hard truth." Somewhere deep inside, Abigail felt a surge of satisfaction. The same silence that once made her feel powerless was now louder than any apology Heather could offer. Across cities and small towns alike, people tuned in. Some paused their morning routines, others scrolled without stopping, but many felt their hearts tighten at the